number 10, we have the escape from Alcatraz. Now, if there's one place you didn't want to end up if you did something rotten, it's Alcatraz. We've all heard of it, the inescapable island used as a prison for extreme convicts in the USA. That is until June 2nd, 1962, when 3 men somehow did the unimaginable: escape Alcatraz. Brothers John and Frank Anglin, along with Frank Morris, all escaped this island, and to this day, the mystery remains, you guessed it, unsolved. Apparently, they had an arts and crafts club in Alcatraz because the men had made dummies out of plaster, flesh-colored paint, and real human hair designed to make them look asleep. They were pretty good. As soon as guards discovered they were missing, the whole place shut down and they began their search. Fortunately for the investigation, but unfortunately for the guy who got left behind. One of them didn't make it out in time, so he helped fill in the gaps. The group began planning in December and fashioned a makeshift drill out of a broken vacuum and loosened the vents at the back of their cells. After sneaking out through the vents, they ran down a typically unguarded corridor and made their way to the rooftop towards their secret workshop. They used over 50 raincoats to fashion makeshift life vests and a rubber raft to help them cross the shark-infested water surrounding the island. They also built wooden paddles and used a musical instrument as a way of inflating the raft. Navigating through a series of shafts to get to the rear of the cell house, the men then climbed over the fence with their gear and sailed away to freedom. So to be fair, they did find out how the men made their escape, but whether they actually made it remains a mystery. Their plan once they got to land included stealing clothes in a car, but no thefts were made. Since their escape, no trace of them has ever been found. Coming in at number 9, we have the anthrax scare. This was a case that the FBI let in right through the front door and still couldn't solve it. Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle had no idea what was about to happen next when he received a letter on October 15th, 2001. Unbeknownst to him, this letter was laced with anthrax, a serious infectious disease. The worst part was he wasn't the only one to receive a letter like this, and 5 people died and 13 people fell ill via these mail attacks. Some even suspect that even more people received these letters but did not fall ill due to the poor quality of the anthrax. The next few years would consist of many lawsuits, and they still had no clear idea of who the culprit might be. That is until Bruce Ivins, a government scientist and suspect, committed suicide. They thought they had him, but even a pool of scientists couldn't confirm that Ivins indeed did it. They still don't know to this day. And coming in at number 8, missing Tammy J. Swickey. Almost 30 years ago, the case of Tammy J. remains unsolved and is still undergoing investigation. Investigators hope that by using updated technology, they may be able to uncover new clues regarding her murder. In August of 1992, Tammy's Pontiac was found abandoned on the side of the road, and her body was later discovered in Missouri, 500 miles away. Despite over 200 pieces of physical evidence, they still can't uncover a single trace of who her killer was. The only piece of significant DNA they found was a beer can nearby, but there was no one they could match the DNA to in their criminal database. Even still, the police are unsure as to whether it even relates to the case. The closest they've come to finding the killer was when officers arrested Clark Perry Baldwin, a 58-year-old man they tied to 3 murders and potentially a 4th he committed between Tennessee and Wyoming. But still, in many regards, the murder of Tammy J. remains open. We have to talk about the Black Dahlia. January 15th, 1947, the severed body of 22-year-old aspiring actress Elizabeth Short was found by a mother and child going for a walk in LA. She would later be dubbed the Black Dahlia, as Elizabeth was often noted to wear black clothing and because of the movie Blue Dahlia, which was out at the time. Despite the harm done to the body, it was obvious that she was not killed where she was found, as there was no blood at the crime scene. Due to the precision and apparent expertise of the murder, many investigators believe it had to be someone in a medical field. But sadly, despite a massive manhunt and countless investigations, the culprit was never found. But even to this day, many people remain passionate about uncovering the true murderer. Steve Hodel, for example, a retired Los Angeles police detective, has developed a captivating case that the murderer was indeed his own father, George Hodel. George Hodel was an impressive doctor in his field, but left his son and family behind when Steve was 9. When Steve found old photos in a bound wooden case of a woman with a striking resemblance to Short, he had to investigate. Despite the evidence he has produced, no one can really claim for sure Dr. Hodel was the murderer. But what if? Cold Valley disappearances. Lewis Clark Valley was nicknamed Cold Valley after a string of disappearances from 1979 to 1982 left the country astounded. 5 people disappeared, but only 3 of the bodies were ever found with no culprit to name. The first of the disappearance was Christina White, who never arrived home, and her schoolwork was found scattered on the outskirts of Osodin. She and her bike were never found. Then Kristen David never finished her bike ride ride from Moscow, Idaho to Lewis Clark Valley, and her body was discovered by a fisherman who found it floating in a garbage bag in Snake River. Then sisters Nelson and Brandy Miller disappeared while walking to the grocery store, while Stephen Purcell, a friend of the two women, also disappeared that night. The bodies of the sisters were found off the side of a highway near Kendrick, Idaho. FBI and the police believe the cases to be linked due to the similarities the victims shared, and Detective Nichols believes that all evidence points to one perpetrator, but she won't reveal his name until enough evidence has been found. But that's just the problem, there's barely any evidence to collect. Despite Nichols' beliefs, some investigators believe there were different killers, but no one can be sure. The case remains unsolved to this day. The Berkshire UFO sighting. Now we've talked about the cases the FBI couldn't solve, but what about the ones they didn't want to? This is one of the most famous alien abductions the world has ever seen, and no one can really deny it. In 1969, Tom Reed in Berkshire, Massachusetts was riding in the car with his brother, mother, and grandmother. As they were crossing the Sheffield Bridge, they caught sight of some mysterious lights coming up from behind them. Suddenly the environment changed, and it felt like they were in the middle of the hurricane. Next thing they remember, they were back in the car, his mother and grandmother had switched places, and realized that over 2 hours had passed. All they could recall were images of being in a hangar with people around. Several eyewitnesses also saw the lights, and even a few media outlets covered the phenomenon. But what's even creepier is that a memo written by Guy Hoddle, the head of the field office in Washington, wrote a report in 1950, 10 years earlier, that stated that 3 flying saucers were recovered in New Mexico, but the FBI never followed up on it. Could it be that these flying saucers had something to do with the mysterious events of Tom Reed, or was there a reason the FBI didn't give this case the attention it deserved? Guess we won't know, will we? Coming in at number 7, the LaSalle Street murders. There's a lot of murder, I'm sorry guys, but it's here. In 1971, Bob Gurse, Bob Hinson, and James Barker were all found murdered at their home. Their only hint? A bloody footprint left behind. The 3 men all worked together, and considering there were no signs of breaking and entering, the police then assumed that they also knew the murderer. Upon their first interrogations, their primary suspect became Theodore B. Uland, who said he last spoke to Hinson at 9 and Gurse at 9:30. Hinson and Gurse had both worked for him, and police began to suspect that Uland had financial motivations, as he blamed the men for stealing equipment, and that he had a life insurance policy out on his 2 former employees. It was discovered that Hinson, Gurse, and Barker all were notorious parties who left a series of lovers in their wake. It was then considered that perhaps a jealous lover or husband took revenge on the 3 men. They then discovered that one of those women visited the house around 1 a.m. but left when there was no answer. The biggest obstacle to this case was the lack of technology, as the police were not equipped with forensics at this time, which meant that the amount of legwork that they were required to do slowed the case down substantially. As a result, the murders remain unsolved. Coming in at number 3, the Hall Mills murder. Investigators initially thought that this 1920s case was a lover's quarrel gone wrong, but no sooner did things get a lot more complicated. In 1922, Reverend Edward W. Hall, who was a pastor in New Brunswick, and Eleanor R. Mills were found murdered. Their bodies were discovered lying side by side, dressed very neatly, near a crabapple tree, a spot considered ideal for lovers. Torn love letters were scattered among their perfectly placed bodies, and they soon found out that the letters were addressed to each other. Both Eleanor and Edward were married, however, so as news of their ardent romance hit the tabloids, the town went wild. The police were confident. They were like, this is easy, we're gonna solve this in 2 days tops. 4 years later, still nothing. His wife was accused, who suspiciously had some of her clothes sent off and re-dyed. His rich brother with a short fuse was a suspect. The only witness was a woman named Jane Gibson, who said she saw 4 people by the crabapple tree after following a suspicious figure around her farm nearby. She then heard a gunshot, followed by screams of a woman. But then her story started changing here and there, and anyways, enough people were accused that they really never got straight down to the story. So I guess sadly, we will never know. Coming in at number 2, the Tylenol tamperings. This next mystery inspired the phrase, "do not use if seal is broken." The Tylenol murders of 1982 changed the game. 12-year-old Mary Kellerman complained of a sore throat one morning, so her parents gave her 1 extra strength Tylenol. Unbeknownst to them, however, it was laced with cyanide, and sadly Mary passed away. What soon followed was a series of Tylenol-related deaths, all including cyanide poisoning. Fortunately, any bottles containing traces of the substances were removed before anyone else made this deadly mistake, but police still wondered how. The only link they found was a man named James Lewis, who wrote a ransom letter for $1 million to Johnson & Johnson claiming to be the killer, but considering he had no relationship to Chicago, which is where the murders took place, he was instead charged with extortion. But still, police believe that someone must have taken the bottles off the shelves and tampered with them, but the case remains unsolved. And last but not least, we have the Zodiac Killer. If you're a fan of all cases cold, well then you've heard of the Zodiac Killer. I mean, there's a movie about it. Between 68 and 69, the Zodiac Killer chose 7 victims in the northern part of California, and luckily 2 victims survived. This cryptic killer gained notoriety by plaguing investigators with ciphers, threats, letters, and information. The Zodiac even phoned the police and admitted to the killings. He loved the attention and threatened to collect more victims should the police not allow his ciphers to be published. The Zodiac Killer is said to have claimed over 37 lives, though no further victims have been found since 1969. This publicity-obsessed murderer left police chilled and confused and continues to boggle minds of investigators to this.
At number 10, we have Tupac Shakur. Alright, we're kicking off this list with a case that left the world shook. And still nobody knows what happened to Tupac that night. It was Las Vegas after the Mike Tyson fight. Tupac had left the fight, was catching a ride with famous producer and murderer Suge Knight. Someone pulled up next to the car and then blah 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 blasted Tupac. Paramedics arrived, but by the time they got him to the hospital, it was too late. Rumors about who was behind this circulated for decades. Recently, Eminem called out Puff Daddy for killing Tupac, which is crazy if you didn't know about the 20 other people who also have called out Puff Daddy for killing Tupac. Some people think that Tupac faked his death and is still alive, but I doubt we will ever know the answer to this mystery. At number 9, we have Elizabeth Short. Better known as the Black Dahlia, this case has been so huge, it's been referenced in films, music, television, everything in pop culture. And with over 70 years after this murder took place, there hasn't even been a whiff of a suspect. A few speculations, but nothing hard. It was on January 15th of 1947 that the body of Elizabeth Short was found. It seemed that someone had killed her with some sort of bladed weapon and then mutilated her body. The story got out to the press and they were the ones who gave her the famous nickname the Black Dahlia. The police launched a massive investigation. Over 100 people were interviewed. It said at one point they had 150 suspects, but with all this blood, sweat, and tears being poured into this case, no arrests were made. Throughout the years, there have many people who have confessed to killing Elizabeth Short, but all these claims are most likely false. There was even an accusation that famous actor Orson Welles was responsible for her murder. Oh my god, that's some juicy Hollywood tea. At number 8, we have Jane Marie Townsend. The problem with trying to catch a murderer back in the 1950s is you had very little to go on. You couldn't use DNA, there was no security cameras, it was basically an eyewitness or nothing. This is what happened to Jane Marie Townsend. She was walking home alone one night after leaving a party. No one knows what happened to her on that walk home, but Jane didn't seem scared leaving the party by herself. It seemed like she thought she was gonna get home safe and sound. The next day, the police get a call about a dead body. When they arrived, they discovered that Jane Marie Townsend had been murdered. The murderer used her own scarf to strangle her to death. The problem was that there was no suspects. Some people thought it might have been an American Army member, but no arrests were made. Later in the 1980s, the police were tipped off by an anonymous person. The case was reopened, but it went cold again. At number 7, we have the O.J. Simpson case. We are going to dig into one of the most prolific court cases in American history. I think the only thing that could be bigger than this is Trump's impeachment process if this actually goes through and Nancy Pelosi gets her way and they televise the whole thing. That will be crazy. That will be like a global Super Bowl. Everyone is gonna watch that. Until that happens, the O.J. Simpson case will reign supreme. For those of you that don't know O.J. Simpson, he was an NFL powerhouse and an international star. His ex-wife Nicole Brown and her lover Ron Goldman were brutally murdered in Nicole's home. This was a vicious case. Both of them stabbed to death. Nicole's head was nearly hacked off. Now, a lot of you at home are like, why is this on the unsolved cases? We know that OJ did this. There's even evidence found after the trial that pointed towards him. There was so much evidence pointing towards him that even though OJ won the criminal case, he lost the civil case against Nicole's family. He even released a book titled If I Did It, where the if was so tiny on the title that the book looked like it just said I did it. Well, you're not wrong, but he was still found innocent. So in a way, justice was never served. This case was technically unsolved, even if the whole world has decided what has happened. At number 6, we have the Tylenol poisonings. You know when you open a container of almost anything and there's that plastic seal on it? Why is that there? Some people think that's to keep in the freshness, but it's actually because of this case in 1982. A few people were dropping dead from Tylenol. This wasn't a bad batch coming straight from the Tylenol people. Someone had been lacing pills with the extremely poisonous chemical cyanide. In total, 7 people were killed, panic hit the streets, and packaging was changed forever, and of course, no one was ever caught. At number 5, we got Betty Shanks. This is one of the most mysterious cases to ever come out of Australia. Betty Shanks was killed one night next to a road and no one ever found out who killed her. It was back in 1952 and Betty's family got the call that she had been the victim of a hit and run. The case was investigated but quickly went cold. Then in 2017, Lyle Reed tried to publish a book giving a detailed breakdown of what happened to Betty that night and who her killer was. He claims that his aunt was friends with Betty and it was a police officer who killed her. Not in cold blood, this wasn't a calculated murder, but a mistake. It was a police officer that ran over Betty with his motorcycle and then covered up the crime scene. There was a lot of evidence on Betty's body that pointed directly to the police officer, like tire marks on Betty's body that match a police motorcycle and markings on her face that match a police officer's knee guard. The cop in question has been dead for over a decade, but Lyle wants the truth to come out. He attempted to publish the book, but all his attempts at publishing it have been denied. At number 4 we have Edgar Allan Poe, the dark anonymous poet who should be known as the original emo. Someone please make a shirt with Edgar Allan Poe's face on it that says the original emo. I need that shirt. His death is still very much a mystery. He was traveling across America from New York to Richmond, but along the way he was spotted in Baltimore. He was wasted. It seemed like the Gothic Wonder had consumed a little too much booze and was having a hard time. So much of a hard time that he was taken to a hospital where he later died. At first most people thought he just died from alcohol poisoning, but after a closer inspection it seemed there was a cocktail of drugs in his system. Edgar wasn't known for being a drug abuser, and after the coroner refused to release his autopsy records, people started to ask questions. There was a few speculated ideas. Maybe a rival writer put out a hit on the big-headed gloomer and tried to take out the competition. There's also a theory that he was a victim of cooping. This is where politicians would hire gangsters to assault and drug strangers, change their clothes, and then force them into voting booths. They could have gone a little too far with this, and this is what led to his death. And for our number 3 spot we have Jack the Ripper, probably one of the most famous cases to ever come out of Old English history. It was back in 1888 when murders started popping up all over. It was mainly prostitutes that were killed in brutal ways. The killer would use a blade, cut open their bodies, take out their organs, and often slash their mouths open so they gaped open almost like a giant puppet or something. It was disturbing and it had police confused for years. Letters started showing up at Scotland Yard describing these killings. They were all titled Jack the Ripper. This was the name that the killer gave to himself. It was unknown whether or not these were coming from the actual killer, but there was one letter that was delivered with a human kidney, and I don't think you get that without putting some holes in some people. There's also speculation that Jack the Ripper was a medical student or a doctor. Because of the precision he was able to cut open these people's bodies. Several murders happened, a lot of them were suspected to be his, but it's unknown how many were actually caused by Jack the Ripper and how many weren't. There could have been copycat killers, or this could have even been someone who was inside the police force tricking his own people, turning people on their heads. This case is one of the most famous of all time. At number 2 we have the Sodder children. I can't think of a worse thing of happening to a family than this. This might be one of the most heartbreaking stories of all time. So it's 1945, Christmas Eve, and the Sodder family is forced to run out of their home because it is burning to the ground. George Sodder, Jenny Sodder, and 4 of their children make it out, but then 3 of their children are still stuck inside. George does everything he can to try and save his children. He tried using a ladder to get up to the rooms, but the ladder breaks. He then tries to use his truck to boost himself to their windows, but the truck won't start. In the end, the house burned to the ground and the Sodders were unable to save their children that were stuck in the house. This left them homeless with a few dead children, all on Christmas Eve. The mystery of this crime comes later. When an investigation was done on the shell of the house after everything was dug up, there was no remains found. There should have been bones of each one of the children, but nothing was found. George and Jenny thought this could mean that their kids were still alive, but in the end they never found out what caused this mystery fire and where the missing remains of their children were. And for our number 1 spot we have the Zodiac Killer. This is one of the creepiest, most interesting cases of unsolved serial killers that I have ever read about, and that's why I'm putting it as number 1 on this list. There are a lot of unsolved murder cases in America, but what made this one so hot was how the Zodiac Killer would taunt the police. He was famous for sending encrypted messages to the police, trying to see if they were smart enough to crack them. Some serial killers never want to be found, while others want to bask in the limelight. Zodiac even sent the bloodied shirt of one of his victims to a police station. There are 5 confirmed deaths that are connected to the Zodiac Killer, but there could be way more that were just just hidden and too hard to find. So we will never know who this man was, unless the memes were right and it was Ted Cruz all along.
Starting us off at number 10 is death by water. One of the fundamentals of human life is that we need water to survive. Not only that, we're made up of approximately 60% water. We sweat water, we clean ourselves with water, and essentially rely on it to get through the day. So what happens when someone is allergic to water? Well, their life becomes about 100 times more complicated. One of the biggest mysteries in the medical field is an extremely rare condition called aquatogenic urticaria, where the skin breaks out into extremely painful hives or rash anytime it's exposed to water. As of a 2013 medical review, only 37 cases have been reported since 1964, most of which were female, as well as most reporting the condition only arose during or right after puberty began. What's insane about this condition is that not only are the afflicted often allergic to rainwater, snow, fresh water, and seawater, but many are allergic to their own sweat and tears, and even worse is that some people get rashes or welts on their lips and mouth area from just trying to drink enough water to stay alive. While there are a few theories out there about what could cause this peculiar nightmare condition, the underlying cause has never been confirmed and continues to perplex the medical community to no end. Coming in at number 9, stone tears. When Chandy was 15, she woke one morning feeling like there was something stuck in her eye. To her surprise, when she went to go and look in the mirror, there was a small stone in her eye, appearing to be coming from her tear duct. Ever since that day in July of 2021, Chadney and her family say that the young girl has cried stones out of her eyes several times a day, every day, and no one has any clue why, or frankly how, this could be happening. Allegedly, in just the 2 months since the ordeal began, Chadney collected nearly 70 stones that had fallen out of her eyes. The family lives in a small rural village in India, and they don't have much money to send her to specialists, but have posted videos online to try and get help for their daughter. According to the doctors that weigh in, there is no known existing condition that could be associated with this, so it's definitely disturbing, especially considering that from what anyone can tell, nothing seems to be out of the ordinary in her actual eyes. Now, truth be told, there are some doctors out there who think it could be a hoax, but nothing has been confirmed, and honestly, no one really knows what is going on. Next up at number 8, the Iceman. You know how there are people out there who like to do a morning cold plunge? Well, one man, Wim Hof, nicknamed the Iceman, seems to have taken that to a whole new level. Born in the Netherlands in 1959, Hof is, as it seems, immune to freezing temperatures. At the age of 17, Hof said he had a sudden impulse to strip down and jump into a half-frozen canal, and it's not that he felt nothing, but he was able to withstand it for far longer than should have made any sense. This turned him into developing what he calls the Wim Hof method, which he says combines frequent exposure to cold paired with special breathing techniques along with yoga and meditation. In fact, Hof set the Guinness World Record for prolonged full body contact with ice and for swimming under ice in 2000. Then in 2012, curious about if it really was all some breathing technique or if he was some kind of medical marvel, researchers in the Netherlands examined samples of Hof's blood and determined that he was somehow able to manipulate his immune system at will, essentially stopping his body from going into a stress response due to the temperature. Now, sure, does his deep breathing help regulate the body? Of course, but Hof would have you believe it's all in the technique. However, there have been several tragic deaths from people attempting his method and subsequently freezing themselves to death, so maybe there is a little more to the story. Coming in at number 7, a human chimera. Due to the nature of how lives are brought into this world, if there's one thing that is never up for debate, it's generally the biological mother of a person. However, one woman named Karen Keegan found herself in the most bizarre and baffling situation. In 2002, Karen was in need of a second kidney transplant after her first one failed, so she underwent genetic testing with her family to see if any of them would be a match and able to donate her. So imagine Karen and her doctor's surprise when the test suggested that genetically, while all her children were siblings, she was not the biological mother of 2 of the 3 children she brought into the world. Her doctor assumed this had to be a mistake, and so they tested once more, but strangely, the results were the same. As it turns out, Karen was a chimera, which is a person composed of 2 genetically distinct cellular lines. Essentially, it turns out that the DNA in her blood was different from the DNA in her ovaries, a phenomenon that her doctor hypothesized came from 2 eggs that were fertilized very early on and fused together when Karen was a fetus in her own mother. Okay, so maybe this one isn't a totally unsolved medical mystery, but you have to admit it's pretty wild. Next up at number 6, foreign accent syndrome. Imagine waking up one morning and suddenly talking in a completely different accent than you have your entire life. While some people might think that you're doing a bit, believe it or not, there is an actual mystery called foreign accent syndrome, or FAS, where the very thing can happen. Most famously was the case in 1941 when a Norwegian woman suffered a traumatic brain injury during an air raid and suddenly and uncontrollably began speaking with a strong German accent. But others include an American woman who suddenly spoke in a mixture of Australian, Irish, and British after a car accident, as well as an Australian woman who suddenly spoke with a French accent after going to sleep with a headache. For a while it was regarded as a psychological disorder, however it is now associated as more of a neurological one, usually onset by head trauma or a stroke. But the part that scientists have not been able to wrap their brains around is how on earth people can seemingly speak in an accent they have never been exposed to. When learning to speak, your natural accent is a result of sound patterns you unconsciously learn, otherwise known as the phonetic system. When you are young, accents can shift as you become exposed to new speech patterns, but by the time you reach your teen years, your phonetic system is pretty much locked in. But FAS somehow affects the entire patterning of your phonetic system and continues to perplex doctors all over the world. Next up at number 5, no appetite. Sometimes when you're feeling under the weather or on certain medication, it's not uncommon to find that your appetite has gone down. However, anyone who has ever met a teenager can attest that of all the people, they are usually the last to lose their appetite. But back in 2013, a 12-year-old named Landon Jones from Iowa baffled doctors after he suddenly woke up one morning feeling faint and with a horrible cough. His parents wasted no time immediately rushing him to the hospital, where it was discovered he had an infection in his left lung, and while the infection was promptly treated, the worst of it was yet to come. For whatever reason, ever since that day, Landon has never had any kind of appetite or thirst. The boy rapidly started losing weight, going from 104 pounds to just 68 right before his parents' eyes, all seemingly due to the fact that he never felt a hunger or thirst cue. As he continued losing weight, his parents were growing more and more worried about their son's strange condition. But no matter what doctor they took him to, they could never get an answer as to what was happening to him. Landon was given countless brain scans, psych evals, medical evals, and tested to make sure he didn't have an eating disorder, but nothing was providing them with an answer. Some doctors have wondered if he suffers from a brain dysfunction in the hypothalamus, the part that controls hunger and thirst, but his case remains unsolved. Next up at number 4, Syndrome X. When Brooke Greenberg was born in 1993, she weighed a mere 4 pounds and had a hip dislocation. Luckily, the hip issue was fixed through a surgery, and although 4 pounds is generally revered as small for a newborn, she was premature and nothing else seemed off, so from what doctors could see, she appeared to be perfectly healthy. However, things started becoming mysterious around the time she was 4 or 5 years old, as her parents and doctors noticed that Brooke appeared to have stopped growing. As the years went by, Brooke remained virtually unaged, a phenomenon that confused every single medical professional that her family seeked out. By the age of 20, she still looked the same as she had when she was 4 years old, measuring less than 3 feet tall and weighing only about 16 pounds. And it wasn't only her appearance that had stopped progressing. Brooke communicated as an infant would, giggling when happy, crying when sad, and continued to wear diapers. Interestingly, the only thing that continued to grow as normal were Brooke's hair and nails. The family took her to endless specialists over the years looking for answers to their daughter's condition, but each one was just as perplexed diagnosed as the next. Some simply said not to worry and that she would catch up, while others prescribed growth hormones, but nothing ever seemed to help their daughter grow. Doctors were completely stumped by this poor girl's condition, calling it Syndrome X, and ever since her death at the age of 20 in 2013, specialists have yet to come up with an explanation. Coming in at number 3, eyes shut. When Natalie Adler was 17, she awoke one morning to find that her eyelids were mysteriously swollen. While this was definitely alarming to Natalie, she didn't initially think much of it. Maybe it was allergies or something along those lines. However, next thing she knew, the condition was only getting worse. Her eyes started to become so swollen that she eventually wasn't able to open them up at all. Even stranger was that it began developing into an inexplicable cycle where they would spasm shut for 3 days, and then they would open for 3 days, and it did that for 13 years. By the time she was 30, doctors were still at a loss for what was causing her rare condition. A condition that is so rare, in fact, that it doesn't even have a name. And even after hundreds of tests, they are no closer to understanding her condition. Over the years, Natalie has undergone several surgeries, none of which have proved successful, however said that she does get Botox injections to help keep her eyes partially open, although she continues to suffer from random bouts of blindness each month. Although doctors have yet to come any closer on how to cure her condition, she continues to see eye specialists, hoping that one day her medical mystery will be solved. Coming in at number 2, twins. There are lots of different kinds of perplexing conditions that have popped up in the medical world over the years, but one of the wildest has to be the story of Sanju Bhagat. Most of his life, Sanju had been incredibly self-conscious about his large stomach, which he described as once being so big he appeared to be 9 months pregnant. What's even more shocking is that for whatever reason, he never received any kind of medical attention for his protruding belly. That was until one day in 1999 when Sanju began to experience shortness of breath and was rushed to the hospital. When he got there, the doctors assumed Sanju had a large tumor in his abdomen and rushed him into the operating room to remove it. However, instead of an enormous tumor they expected, they could not believe their eyes when they opened him up and found the remains of a half-formed twin that had been living inside of him the last 36 years. The condition, called fetus in fetu, is incredibly rare, having only been documented 90 times in medical literature throughout history. As it turns out, when Sanju had been in the womb, his twin had become trapped inside and essentially became a parasite. Most that suffer this condition do not live long, often not even surviving inside their own mother, so doctors were completely flabbergasted and unable to explain how this man had lived 36 years with the twin inside of him. And last up today in our number 1 spot, no pain. Well, most of the time we try to avoid it since you know it hurts and it isn't fun. Knowing that you are in pain is actually really important because it helps you keep from getting more hurt. Like when you burn your arm on the 400-degree oven rack and it hurts like hell, so you immediately move your arm away. Or maybe you break your ankle and it obviously hurts, so you stop walking, thus hopefully stopping you from making it even worse. So with that in mind, imagine a life where nothing was telling you you were in pain. Well, that's exactly what Gabby Gingras has had to deal with her whole life. Now 23, Gabby has never felt a semblance of pain her whole life. As a little one, her parents said she would chew her hands until they looked like raw meat, but would never cry, and it was then that they knew something was not right. Then a few years later, Gabby scratched herself blind in one eye and had to wear goggles to sleep until she was old enough to understand her condition. As a kid, she routinely, unwittingly injured herself, once knocking out all of her teeth, another time getting second-degree burns from standing too close to a radiator, and even broke her own jaw but had no idea for several weeks. Even seemingly small things like weather conditions don't faze her. She has to be reminded to wear a coat in the winter so she doesn't get frostbite, or stand in the shade in the summer, as she's completely unaware of how to gauge temperature. Her condition is called hereditary sensory autonomic neuropathy, or HSAN, and while there is no cure, and the cause of the condition remains a big question mark to medical professionals, with proper support and learning from an intellectual perspective what can be dangerous, most people can thankfully live a totally normal life.
Alright,
Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have Henry Baltimore Jr. In 1973, Henry was a 21-year-old honors student at the University of Michigan who had a very promising future ahead of him. In March of that year, Henry was unfortunately attacked inside of his apartment. Two men broke in and tied him to the bed before stealing both money and material items. Henry was reluctant to report this incident to the police, but did end up doing so. After this, a suspect named Roy Davis was arrested and charged with armed robbery, and Henry was scheduled to testify at his hearing, but never showed up. 2 days after the hearing, Henry did resurface and asked the prosecutors to drop the charges because he was frightened, but they refused and Henry was rescheduled to testify. 2 days before this rescheduled hearing, Henry ended up disappearing very suspiciously. Originally, people believed that he may have gone into hiding considering how vocal he was about being frightened, but that belief quickly went away and people began to suspect something a lot more sinister was at play. Henry's family especially knew something was wrong because there was no way that he would disappear without telling at least one of them. Without Henry and his testimony, Roy ended up taking a plea deal and only was sentenced to 6 weeks. Roy was of course considered a person of interest in Henry's disappearance, and a neighbor of Henry's even said that they saw Roy and another man knocking on Henry's door the day he disappeared, but Roy's mother offered her son an alibi. Roy has never been formally charged for the disappearance. The two theories of what happened to Henry are either that someone abducted and took the life of Henry to prevent him from testifying, or Henry left Michigan, changed his identity, and assumed a new name. You would have hoped if it was the latter, he would have at least told one of his family members. His case remains open almost 50 years later, and who knows, if someone out there who's watching this video knows something about this case, please call in and give any and all information over to the authorities. The remaining family members of Henry deserve to know what happened to this extremely bright young man. In our number 9 spot today, we have Cody James and Gary Harker. Cody James and Gary Harker were longtime friends who were working together on Christmas Day in 1979 in Moline, Illinois. They left Cody's shop to head out in the truck to deliver an air compressor to Rock Island, Illinois, and then head to pick up a $500 payment for it in Davenport, Iowa, which they never made it to. The black truck they were driving was found almost 2 months after they had gone missing, and subsequently was put up for auction after not being claimed for 40 days. The bodies of Cody and Gary were found in the truck bed by the men who ended up purchasing it. 25 years after their deaths, the case was still unsolved, and a friend of Cody and Gary brought police a roll of film that they had been entrusted to by the men. When Cody and Gary gave their friend this film all those years earlier, they said, quote, "If anything happens to us, develop this film." It is crazy to think that this friend waited 25 years to spill this tea, and that perhaps the men knew what was going to happen to them. Unfortunately, the film didn't end up giving police any solid leads, although the case continues to be investigated. In our number 8 spot today, we have Christopher Wallace, also known as the Notorious B.I.G. Christopher Wallace is much better known by his alias, and he was one of the most famous rappers of the 1990s. And even though he was just getting his start, he is considered one of the best rappers of all time. Biggie was a New York rapper, but he was unfortunately killed in March of 1997 after a drive-by shooting while he was in Los Angeles. In 1996, the tensions between the East and West Coast hip-hop and rap scenes were rising, and after the death of Tupac in Las Vegas, rumors began to swirl about Biggie and his possible involvement in that killing. Unfortunately, the people who killed Biggie have never been found, and that is where the mystery comes in. There are a lot of similarities between the killings of Big and Tupac, and since neither of them are solved, there are so many rumors about what exactly happened. Some theories span from a gang member with financial motives to a planned hit by a record company in order to boost sales. There is so much speculation and so many possibilities surrounding this, and I really hope that one day we find out who committed this unbelievable crime. Notorious B.I.G. was only able to release 1 album before his death, but had 3 albums released posthumously, with the first one achieving a diamond certification in the US. In our number 7 spot today, we have Elizabeth Short, or the Black Dahlia. This is one of the most famous cold cases ever, and that is because it is horrifying, extremely dark, and super mysterious. Elizabeth Short was an aspiring actor, but her life was cut tragically short by an incredibly inhumane act. Elizabeth's body was found when she was only 22 years old in a vacant lot near a park in Los Angeles in January of 1947. The crime was highly publicized because of how graphic it was, but whoever did this was sure to leave little to no evidence behind. A few days after the crime, someone claiming to be the person who committed this crime called to say that he would eventually turn himself in, but wanted police to search for a while. But he also said he would send in some of Beth Short's belongings. He did follow through on this and did send in things, such as her birth certificate, but this didn't end up giving investigators any leads. During the initial investigation, 60 different men confessed to this crime, and since then there have now been over 500 confessions, which is absolutely insane. There are honestly too many theories on this one to even get into right now, and it is quite possible that we may never know what exactly happened to Elizabeth. In our number 6 spot today, we have Jill Dando. Jill was an English journalist and a television presenter until she was killed outside of her southwest London home in 1999. This created the biggest manhunt the country had ever seen since the Yorkshire Ripper in the 70s. A man named Barry George was originally convicted and sentenced to prison for this terrible crime, but he ended up actually being acquitted years later, which now leaves this case unsolved. Jill's next door neighbor heard a surprised gasp from Jill, but he never heard like a shot, and it sounded more like someone who was greeting an old friend. The same neighbor looked out the window and actually saw whoever the killer is, but of course at the time they didn't know who he was or what had just happened, and he also didn't recognize the man, so unfortunately he was unable to give an identification. There are a ton of speculations and rumors about who took Jill's life, and it ranges from a potential stalker to maybe even like a crazy hit job. Hopefully one day there will be answers on why someone would have done something so horrible to Jill. In our number 5 spot today, we have Patricia Meehan. This is a story that really just gives me the chills because the circumstances surrounding it are exceptionally strange. On April 20th, 1989, Patricia Bernadette Meehan was in a car accident on Highway 200 near Circle, Montana. Witnesses saw her driving her car on the wrong side of the road, which then led to her crashing into off-duty police dispatcher Carol Heights. Carol was luckily uninjured in the crash, and she got out of her vehicle right away. Upon exiting her vehicle, Carol saw Patricia also exit her vehicle, walk up to her, and just stare at her without saying a word. Patricia then walked away, climbed over a fence, and then stood staring at the accident before walking away and disappearing, which, like, literally just talking about it gives me goosebumps. It is so strange. A search began immediately but turned up little results. There have been thousands of reported sightings of Patricia that have potentially given police leads to her whereabouts, but she still has never been found. In our number 4 spot today, we have the Mary Celeste. The Mary Celeste first set sail on November 17th, 1872 with a cargo full of alcohol. Whatever happened over the next month isn't quite clear, but what we do know is that on the afternoon of December 5th of the same year, another ship on the Atlantic crossing found her drifting somewhere between Azores and Portugal. The captain of this ship knew the captain of the Mary Celeste and knew that he was a skilled and capable sailor, so he was extremely suspicious. He ordered a crew to board the Mary Celeste, and when they did, they found that the ship had been deserted, but it was in full seaworthy condition, so why had they abandoned it? Especially the captain. The captain of the ship that found the derelict split his crew and sailed the Mary Celeste to Gibraltar for more investigations, but despite this, the captain, his family, and the crew of 7 that were on board the Mary Celeste simply just disappeared, and no one knows what happened or where they could have gone. I think this one is so famous because it seemingly just has no answers tied to it at all. Like, it really is just one of those mysteries with next to nothing to go off in terms of any sort of clues. In our number 3 spot today, we have the Yuba County 5. On February 24th, 1978, 5 men from Yuba City, California attended a basketball game at California State University. All 5 men went missing after this night, and several days later, the group's car was found abandoned in a remote area of the Plumas National Forest that was way out of the way from where they should have been. There was no reason for the car to have been abandoned because it was in totally fine working condition when it was found. In June of 1978, 4 of the men were found passed away near a trailer camp that is deep in the forest, but the 5th man has never been found. There is a lot of strange information about this case, such as how one of the men starved to death even though he was surrounded by food. There is truly too much to cover about this story that I unfortunately don't have time for, but if you're interested, I would highly highly recommend looking it up because this case is truly unexplainable and absolutely terrifying. In our number 2 spot today, we have Jim Gray. Jim Gray was an incredibly important computer scientist who was responsible for many computer advancements that changed things for all of us. Other than being a computer scientist, he was also a really experienced and skilled sailor, and one day, on January 28th, 2007, he set sail for a short trip so he could head out and spread his mother's ashes as she had recently passed away. As his trip began, Jim spoke to his wife on the phone and said he would give her a call once he got back in range. After their phone call, he called his daughter as well and left a little message for her, and that was when he was off on his trip, but unfortunately he never ended up returning. Jim's wife Donna was the one who raised the alarm bells as she was away on a trip, but like I mentioned, Jim said he would call her later, and he never did. At this point is when huge searches began. Thousands of images of the area where Jim or his boat might be were uploaded to the Amazon Mechanical Turk for people to look through and see if they could find any kind of signs, but to no avail. Jim also had an automatic emergency position indicating beacon on his ship, but whatever happened to Jim and the ship clearly didn't meet the requirements, or perhaps it had some sort of malfunction, or maybe it was even turned off. To this day, no one knows what happened to Jim or his boat, as no sign or trace of either has ever been found. The theories of what may have happened are endless and range from Jim intentionally disappearing to him being kidnapped for his computer skills and brain in order to do some kind of inside job, and everything in between. There most definitely are theories that are seemingly more likely than others, but at the end of the day, they are all a possibility. In our number 1 spot today, we have Mauro de Moro. Moro was an Italian investigative journalist, and it is said that his profession is most likely what led to his disappearance. On the evening of September 16th, 1970, he was coming back home from work but never actually returned. Before his disappearance, he apparently was convinced that he had the story of a lifetime, and he even had told his co-workers that he had a story that was going to shake Italy. There are 3 main speculations and theories about what this story might have been and what could have happened. One theory is that the story could have been related to the death of a man named Enrico, who was the president of Italy's state-owned oil and gas conglomerate, ENI. The next was that his story could have been about finding a drug trafficking network between Sicily and the United States, and the final theory is that his disappearance might have been related to a failed right-wing coup that took place in the 70s. Despite extensive searches, he has never been found, and in fact 2 of the main detectives who started this case both had their lives taken by the mafia. It is believed that Moro was a victim of what is called lupara bianca, which is a journalistic term for when the mafia takes the life of someone in such a way that their body will never be found. Whatever story he was working on, we'll likely never know, and it's such a tragedy that a job he was so passionate about is most likely what led to his disappearance.
Coming in at number 10, we have the treasure of Lima. Back when the Spanish had colonized most of Central and South America, they were going to great lengths to collect all the treasures they could find. They wanted to make one of the largest collections of wealth the world has ever seen, and they managed to put together a pretty good pile until revolutions started popping up all over the place. The island of Lima held a massive treasure, and to save it from falling into the hands of the people who were revolting, the Spanish government made a plan to move all the goods to Mexico. This shipment of goods contained several gold statues, rare jewels and metals, and even just straight up cash. Now here's where things get murky. Some people say that the treasure made its way to Mexico. Other people say the treasure was hijacked by William Thomas and his men took the treasure to Cocos Island, but they were arrested and executed before they could come back to claim it. Others say the Mexicans struck a deal with Thomas and now the treasure is hidden. Coming in at number 9, we have the crystal skulls. One of the strangest artifacts that has ever been uncovered in Mexico are the crystal skulls. They are extremely rare and well crafted, and they could have just been pieces of art that were commonly traded for goods back in the 7th and 8th century. This was when the Mayans were a prominent civilization in Mexico. Now, the mystery behind these skulls mixes into a few different areas. First, no one really knows who made them. They are so rare and they are so dispersed. Some of them are even being found in southern countries like Belize. It's unclear how many people had the skill to make such a piece. Also, there is a mystical element to this. There is a legend that says once all 13 skulls are found, it will bring the end of the world. So I guess we should probably stop looking for these things. Coming in at number 8, we have the Dead Zone. Yeah, anything that catches that nickname can't bring something happy. You don't call a place the Dead Zone because it's full of candy and sunshine, unless you're trying to lure kids in there so you can eat them. The Dead Zone is an area in the state of Durango. For whatever reason, it's almost impossible to get any sort of radio waves to pass through this area. If you get lost in there, you might be stuck in this desert until the blazing heat takes you to a dehydrated grave. Now, this has baffled scientists for years, and recently it has been chalked up to an electromagnetic disturbance. orbits, but there hasn't been enough research to verify this. Also, many people have made claims of seeing extraterrestrials in the area. Coming in at number 7, we have the death of Mario Amato. This is a wild case with a series of twists and turns. It starts off with two couples heading down from California to Mexico for a nice getaway. The year was 1992. The couples consisted of Mario and his girlfriend Paula, and his brother Joe and his girlfriend Debbie. They all arrived in Mexico at a condo in Rosarito Beach. The couples would be staying there for the weekend. The first night ended with Mario and Paula getting into a vicious argument, which eventually cooled down. The next day, Joe and Debbie were out, and Paula and Mario got into it again, and this time Mario was arrested. When Joe and Debbie came back to the house, no one was there, and Paula arrived later, but Mario was still missing. It was not long after this that the police arrived and told the three of them that Mario was dead. He had hung himself in jail. This was very suspicious, and after an autopsy, it would seem that Mario had a serious injury to his liver before he was hung, and there was a lot of evidence showing that he was murdered, but the police closed the investigation and called it a suicide. Coming in at number 6, we have Where Are the Aztec Rulers? When you go back through time, you can find a lot of the burial sites of ancient rulers. If you go snooping around a pyramid, you might find a sarcophagus that has some old dude who's mummified and he's stuck in there. But the thing with the Aztec rulers is that none of them have been found. Now, this could be for a few reasons. Some people speculate that the Aztecs used to burn their leaders and spread their ashes after they died. But there could be a chance that the remains were kept somewhere sacred and we haven't discovered it yet. Coming in at number 5, we have the Mexican Mothman. A little over a decade ago, there were some very strange reports coming from the town of La Genta, Mexico. People had claimed that they saw a massive winged creature that looked as if it might have been part human. People from all over the city were saying that something that was around 9 feet tall, covered head to toe in hair, and had a massive wingspan was flying over people and following them. The explanation for these sightings has never been solved. This could have been a hoax put together by some local kids who were trying to freak people out, or did Mothman actually work his way down to Mexico for a little visit? Coming in at number 4, we have the Island of Dolls. One of the creepiest things that I have ever seen. The Island of Dolls is a famous tourist attraction that is deep in the jungle close to Mexico City. The former owner of this island found the body of a dead girl who had drowned in a river close by, along with her doll that was floating next to her. He took the doll and hung it up to appease the spirit of the girl. For the next few years, he hung up more dolls to keep the girl's ghost happy, until one day when the man was found dead. He drowned in the exact same spot as the girl. No one knows how he died in that exact spot. Coming in at number 3, we have Gordon Collins. Another story of couples heading down to Mexico for a little trip. Maybe you should go in groups of 3 and then you'll be fine. Gordon, his girlfriend, and his 2 friends went down to Mexico for vacation. They were supposed to stay there for a week. One day they rented a boat and they went out to do some fishing, but a huge storm hit and 3 of their bodies were found dead in the water. It was thought that Gordon was also dead from the storm until a few days later when he was seen walking around the fishing village. His parents came down to find him, but after following a trail of sightings, he was nowhere to be found. Then he popped up in Cabo San Lucas. His parents chased him down again, and once again, he was nowhere to be found. After this, 70 sightings of him were reported, but he was never found by anyone looking for him. It's thought that he might have been suffering from amnesia. Coming in at number 2, we have Meja Island. How can you make a whole island disappeared? Well, it seems like somehow someone did this. The Meja Island was apparently an island just off the coast of the Yucatan in the Atlantic Ocean. There are documents recording the location of this island that date back over 400 years, but in the 1970s, it would seem that the island existed no more. The location of where the island apparently was is now just an open area of ocean. Not even like the island sunk below sea level because of rising water levels. No, there's no trace of this island ever being in the area. There are rumors that the United States destroyed the island so they could travel through the area without breaking international charter laws, but if they did this, how did they do it? And coming in at the number 1 spot, we have Chichen Itza. This is one of the most famous structures in the world, built by the ancient Mayan civilization. It stands as one of the wonders that will blow anyone's mind. This is a similar mystery akin to the pyramids. There are rooms inside Chichen Itza that are built so perfectly that you can hear into other rooms, and it's said high-ranking officials would wait in these rooms and eavesdrop on conversations so they could seem like they had godly knowledge. There's also a point at the front of the pyramid that produces an amazing echo response. When you clap at the front of this point, it sends out a noise that can be heard a kilometer in every direction. It's these amazing feats of ingenuity that make people wonder, how did they build it? I know a lot of you people think that aliens built the pyramids, and I know you guys know that I love conspiracy theories, but I'm going to go on a different angle. The mystery is, what technology did they have? Everything they built was so precise, we still have no idea how they did it. There are points in Chichen Itza that are lined up perfectly with the points of north, south, east, and west. So the question stands, how did they do it?
Coming into number 10, we have Where is Cynthia? This is a very bizarre missing persons case that was also featured on US TV show Unsolved Mysteries. Cynthia Anderson was a legal secretary from Ohio in 1980. The 20-year-old loved crime and romance novels, but began having a reoccurring dream that an intruder entered her home. She told her mother about it, but she didn't think too much of it until she started receiving weird phone calls at work. Her employers even went as far as to have an emergency buzzer installed on her desk. On the morning of August 4th, 1981, she wasn't at work, but her car was in the car park. On her desk was a novel that she was reading, but the page was open on a passage that detailed an abduction. A month later, the local police started getting weird calls saying that Cynthia was being held in a basement, but wouldn't give any further detail. To this day, she's never been found, and that case is cold. Coming into number 9, we have Who Shot Tupac? But like, who? Tupac Shakur was one of the most famous rappers in the world when he was killed in Las Vegas in September 1996, nearly 23 years ago to the day. He was just 25 years old when he was gunned down in Vegas, having seen Mike Tyson and Frank Bruno fight, which must have been epic. As Tupac and his entourage stopped at a red light in the Flamenco Road and Koval Lane area, he was shot 4 times. He died 6 days later and was not in a state to identify his killer. Earlier that night, it was reported that the rapper had beef with the street gang, the Crips. They could have had something to do with it, we'll just never know. A witness came forward, but then they were murdered in New Jersey, thousands of miles away, before they could even submit to further police questioning and identify a suspect. Of course, there are people out there that still believe Tupac is alive and living under a new identity. Perhaps we'll never know. Coming into number 8, we have the Children of Hamelin. So you guys may have heard of the Pied Piper, a little fairy tale with a pretty key moral at the end of it. Pay your bills, if not a bohemian musician will steal your kids. Right? Well, it turns out that there is more than just a lesson to this story. There is actually an 800-year-old unsolved mystery. You see, the Pied Piper of Hamelin was actually a real man, a piper dressed in exuberant clothing who turned up in Lower Saxony in the village of Saxon itself in 1284. According to church records, he did steal 130 children from the town who were never seen or heard from again. They were simply spirited away. But were they? We just don't know. Coming into number 7, we have Stonehenge. We're taking it back to my home country of England, but what is going on? What's going on with Stonehenge? I don't know. Stonehenge sits pretty in the Salisbury Plains in England and was laid out around 4,000 years ago at a time where transporting and lifting 50-ton sarsen sandstone and bluestone rocks was legitimately beyond human capability. Aside from the mystery of how it was built, we also don't know what it was used for. The main theory is that it was for some kind of religious worship, although there were far more cosmic suggestions. The structure is aligned with various celestial objects and has been the focus of pagan celebration, especially around the summer solstice. Archaeological digs have also suggested that a breed of giant cows were used either to assist in the construction or, were just chilling there, present, mooing. Cows are just so great. Does anyone ever just stop and think about cows? I love cows, even ancient giant cows. Cows! Moo. Recently discovered underneath the stone structure were 17 further mysterious ancient monuments, which just adds more mystery to the pile of mystery. It's a mystery sundae with a side of mystery and a mystery cherry on top. Coming in at number 6, we have the Zodiac Killer. The Zodiac Killer is one of the most elusive serial killers in modern American history. The mystery male murdered at least 5 people, but claims to be behind the deaths of up to 37 people. Despite no arrests, the California Department of Justice has maintained an open case file on the Zodiac murders since 1969. The Zodiac Killer murdered 3 women and 1 man, with 2 other male victims surviving. The killer claimed to have killed many people in the infamous ciphers, which were sent to the police. The Zodiac Killer killer was given their name as a result of the cryptograms sent to the police, which were a mystery unto themselves. One of those has definitely been solved, but the others not so much. The last known Zodiac murder was in the 1970s, so in theory the killer could be dead, or they could be living out their days among us, which is terrifying. So yeah, despite descriptions of the male killer at the time and many sketches of him, the case is unsolved and the murderer is, or was, at large. This is so mysterious. At number 5, we have the Texarkana Moonlight Murders. Who was the Phantom Slayer? Honestly, we don't know. The Texarkana Moonlight Murders were a series of very grisly killings that took place in Texas in the spring of 1946. 8 people were attacked over 10 weeks, with 5 of the victims succumbing to their injuries. A pair of survivors claimed that the killer was wearing a white pillowcase with eye holes cut out over his head. What a ghoul. All of the attacks happened to couples and took place on weekends. The murders sent the town of Texarkana into absolute panic, as I'm sure you can imagine. City inhabitants locked themselves indoors with guns, and it was kinda like scenes from The Purge out there. The Texas Rangers were even called in, and people started arming up and taking to the streets to try and catch the killer, but the assailant never struck again. At the time, the Texas Ranger captain saw that the criminal killer was, and I quote, a shrewd criminal who left no stone unturned to conceal his identity and activities. He was never caught. Coming into number 4, we have the dark deaths of Overton Bridge. I've never heard of a dog taking their own life until now, but it seems that there's a bridge in Dumbarton in beautiful, beautiful Scotland which is A, haunted, and B, has claimed the lives of many dogs. This makes me feel really sad. It seems that since the 1960s, nearly 100 dogs have leapt to their death from the bridge, falling 50 feet into jagged rock below. Why the dogs have jumped? We just don't know. Reportedly, they freak out and they leap. The Scottish Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals has sent teams to investigate, but nobody has yet solved the mystery. While the dog deaths are the main issue, it seems that a man inexplicably threw his baby from the bridge in 1994. Now dogs are firmly required to be on leashes. Coming into number 3, we have the Phoenix Lights. What was going on in the skies of Arizona, Nevada, and Sonora? In 1997, thousands of people saw what they thought were UFOs in the sky between 7:30 and 10 p.m. at night. Thousands of people reported triangular formations of lights passing over the southern states and in North Mexico. A sizable number of people also reported actually seeing a UFO. One witness, who didn't want to be named, which I kind of understand, said, "It was totally silent. I've never seen anything close to the colors from the exhaust that propelled that thing. It was as big as downtown Prescott and completely blocked out the stars." Now, the shared phenomenon actually had a lot of credible witnesses, including the Arizona Governor Fife Symington. While the original event happened 22 years ago, possible reoccurrences have happened in 2007 and 2008. Coming into number 2, we have the case of D.B. Cooper. On November the 24th, 1971, the eve of Thanksgiving, a man using the name Dan Cooper successfully hijacked a Boeing 727 plane in the airspace between Portland and Seattle. The man boarded the plane as a passenger and ordered a bourbon and soda. After takeoff, he handed a note to a flight attendant, but she didn't read it, assuming it was his phone number. Creepy. He then leant over to her and said, "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." Not what you want to hear. Long story short, he demanded and successfully extorted $200,000 in ransom, over $1 million in today's currency. He then parachuted out of the plane, jettisoned, gone. Nobody knew whether he landed alive or where he was at all. There was an extensive manhunt from the FBI, but the man's real identity has never been solved. Numerous theories were circulated. The serial number on the cash he stole were also released and searched for, but again, no trace was found. As of 2016, the investigation has been suspended and remains one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries. Finally, coming into number 1, a mystery of our age, we have the disappearance of flight MH370. Malaysian Airlines 370 disappeared on March the 8th, 2014, flying from Kuala Lumpur Airport to Beijing in China. The aircraft last made contact with air traffic control when it was over the South China Sea, less than an hour hour after takeoff, before then completely disappearing from their radar. The last words from Captain Shah were, "Good night, Malaysian 370. The plane was still tracked on military radar, which suggested that actually it deviated to cross the Malay Peninsula, until finally disappearing from radar altogether over the Andaman Sea. Oddly, no phone calls of distress or signals were sent out or anything like that. No word. Silence. The black box could have shed light on what happened, but it was never found. Neither was the plane or its wreckage, despite millions of dollars being spent on finding it. So what happened? Alien abduction? ISIS abduction? It simply disappeared into a parallel universe? We just don't know. Do you guys have any answers to these mysteries? And again, don't forget to let me know what the weirdest thing that's ever happened to you is.
Starting us off at number 10 is the Battery Man. Slavisa Pajkic, aka Biba Struja, aka Electric Biba, is a man who since the age of 17 has apparently had electricity coursing through his body at all times. He can literally fry a hot dog with his bare hands. He claims he's an insulator, accumulator, conductor, and heater all in one. Using 2 metal pins, he can even make a light bulb light up, even though if any normal person touched 220 volts, they would die. Not him though, it's not even a thing for him. Just makes it look so easy. He even makes an electric circuit with him and a bunch of his students holding hands, and he helps people with their sinus and back problems, their migraines. Like, look at what his touch does to these people. Look at this clip right now.
Rada u grad I pomažem ljudima. Migrena, glavobolja, sinusi, problemi sa kičmom. Trudim se 50-50.
And if that didn't manage to convince you, he became a Guinness World Record holder back in 1981 when he touched a few thousand volts. He also heated water to 97 degrees Celsius in the record time of 1 minute and 37 seconds. And no one knows how he has this power, how the electricity entered him and never left, how he controls it, or how he hasn't died from it yet. We just have no idea. But I would love to be like a walking appliance. It would save me so much money on electricity.
In at number 9, the Paulding Light. A small light that appears in a valley outside of Paulding, Michigan. This has been a mystery that has been puzzling investigators since the 1960s.
It almost looks like a flame, man. How it flickers? Yeah, it looks like a flame out there.
Look, it's red on it now.
It's coming real close.
Yep, you see it? It's going red now.
Some believe it's a ghost, while others claim it could be some sort of geological activity or even some natural gases. The light appears in the same spot almost every night, and of course there are tons of myths and legends surrounding the light. Some claim it's the light of a railroad brakeman who was killed while trying to stop an oncoming train from colliding with a car stuck on the tracks. Others claim it's a grandparent looking for a lost grandchild, using a lantern that needs constant relighting, which is why the light seems to come and go. In 2010, the Paulding Light was featured on the show Fact or Faked Paranormal Files, who couldn't come up with a reasonable explanation for the random light.
At number 8, we have the disappearance of Frederick Valentich. On the 21st of October 1978, Australian pilot Frederick Valentich was doing a 125 nautical mile training flight. Now, the 20-year-old had no idea that that would be the last flight of his career. Known as a flying saucer enthusiast, Frederick radioed Melbourne air traffic control saying this.
Is there any known traffic below 5,000 feet?
No known traffic.
Seems to be a large aircraft below 5,000 feet.
Now, if you didn't understand what he said and it's unclear, he's asking if there's any known traffic below 5,000 feet. They respond saying no known traffic. He then claimed there was an unidentified aircraft that was following him at 4,500 feet, which clearly wasn't a plane. It was illuminated by 4 bright landing lights and seemed to be moving at quite a fast speed. He then reported that it seemed to be approaching him from the east and that maybe the pilot was pranking him. The craft started orbiting above him, and that's when Frederick started experiencing engine problems. Now have a listen to the last few things he said in his transmission before contact was lost.
It's not an aircraft, it's hovering, and it's not an aircraft.
Search parties were sent out and covered 1,000 square miles around the perimeter, yet he was never found. The last thing he says is it's not an airplane, and then contact just gets lost. Like, where did you go? Were you abducted by aliens?
At lucky number 7, Dale Kerstetter. This mystery is exactly that because no one knows the answers to anything, really. September 12, 1987, Kerstetter started his weekend shift as a security guard at the Corning Glassworks plant in Bradford, Pennsylvania. When another security guard arrived the next morning to relieve Kerstetter of his shift, Dale was nowhere to be found. $250,000 of platinum pipe was also missing. However, Kerstetter's truck was still in the parking lot, and after the police were called to investigate, they were stumped. The keys to the truck were still in the ignition. Kerstetter, a heavy smoker, Killer left behind a full carton of cigarettes. The only thing missing was his .22 caliber pistol. What's even more interesting is Dale's lunchbox was full, and upon reviewing security footage, about 10 minutes into Kerstetter's shift, a masked man is seen approaching the back of the plant. Kerstetter is seen walking up to him and then looked directly at the camera. The two men were never seen again. To this day, some believe Kerstetter was part of a heist, while others think he was coerced into the crime. He was looking at the camera as a signal of asking for help. Kerstetter had 6 kids and 2 grandchildren at the time of his disappearance. No one has seen or heard from him since that night, and many are still wondering what really happened to Dale Kerstetter.
Now at number 6 is the sand geysers. So everyone knows about water geysers. They're out here going to Iceland and chilling in those hot geyser baths and whatnot. Nothing new, I wish I could do that. But back in 2008, in the eastern city of Al Asa in Saudi Arabia, a sand geyser just appeared out of nowhere. The sand was coming out and reached 9 meters in vertical length, but no one was able to explain how the phenomenon was happening. Several Almaco geological teams went to the site to get to the bottom of it, but they simply couldn't. Some claim it could have been because of an earthquake tremor, since some sand volcanoes form during large earthquakes, but 11 years later they're still clueless about the real origins of the sand geyser.
Halfway through our list at number 5, the Cowboy Bandit. This one is insane because this guy somehow has been eluding the police for over 30 years. It started back in 1987 on September 19th, when a man entered a bank in Spokane, Washington and robbed them of $100,000. The man who robbed the bank was described as wearing glasses, a cowboy hat, and cowboy boots. When he pulled the gun on the teller asking to be taken to the vault, he also revealed a police scanner, making it clear he'll know if anyone calls for the police. After completing his first robbery, the Cowboy Bandit would go on to rob about a dozen banks total, even being captured on camera at some of them. Although it took a while to get the bandit on camera, while he was robbing a bank, one of the tellers set off a bill trap, which is located under some of the bills the tellers were handing over to the bandit during a robbery. This not only notified the police, but also activated the bank's cameras. Still, even though he was caught on camera, to this day, law enforcement have not been able to find the Cowboy Bandit.
At number 4 is the max headroom interruption. Now I feel like many people have seen this signal interruption that happened back in November of 1987 already, but we're going to show it again. The signal intrusion happened at about 9 PM during the sportscast news on WGN TV and lasted about 28 seconds. The second intrusion happened during Doctor Who and that lasted about 90 seconds. It's been 30 years now and the hijackers behind the interruption are still unknown, and honestly the whole thing was just really creepy. The person in the video is wearing a max headroom mask and sunglasses with this buzzing sound in the background. In the first intrusion he's just swaying from side to side, bobbing his head up and down in front of this metallic striped background. In the second one, the person actually talks, saying he's a freaking nerd. Heeing away, he starts humming and singing a song and seems like he's on some kind of high level of drugs. He goes on to say, "I just made a giant masterpiece for all the greatest world newspaper nerds," and I mean, he's not wrong. 30 years later, we're still talking about it, trying to figure out who it was.
In at number 3, Leah Rowland. At around 10:30 AM on March 20th, 1997, Leah Rowland was working as the manager of a gas station in Nebraska. The mother of 2 had just gotten promoted the day before and didn't think twice when a red Pontiac Grand Am pulled in to get some gas. The man in the red car walked into the gas station without shoes on and sweatpants rolled up to his knees. He waited for a mother and her daughter to leave the store and then approached the counter. Leah was instructed to hand over the money in the cash register, which she did, a total of $150. She was then told to lay on the ground. Complying with everything the robbers said, Leah wasn't expecting him to shoot her 3 times, twice in the arm and once in the head, killing her instantly. The suspect then took off with the money, some soda, a pack of cigarettes, a lighter, and the gas he filled his car up with. Although there was surveillance footage of the entire crime, to this day, Leah's killer has never been found.
Now at number 2 is the Hampton Court Palace ghost. Now this grand estate was the home of Henry VIII and all his 6 wives and all their kids. And I feel like I learned about this guy in history at primary school more than I learned about anyone. It was a tie between him and both world wars, so I mean that's saying something. So the staff at the palace had the alarm go off, which meant the fire doors were open, but when they rushed to check there was nothing there. But in the footage you can see the doors opening even though no one's physically opening them, and then a man appears out of nowhere in medieval clothing and leaves through the doors.
You don't see the doors actually being pushed open by hand. Figure strides forward and slams them shut. As you can see, and close-ups have shown that it appears to be dressed in medieval clothes, similar to what Henry VIII would have worn.
Now, no one saw any person come in and out of the building, yet the footage shows otherwise, and it looks like a skinnier version of Henry VIII, to be honest. Like maybe the afterlife made him skinnier. Like a diet plan, though.
Taking the top spot on our list at number 1, Bigfoot. Now you most likely already know the story here, but for those that don't, well, it's quite an interesting one. Bob Gimlin and Roger Patterson filmed what some say is a real-life Bigfoot, and others claim to be a hoax way back in 1967. The story goes the two men were searching for Bigfoot. Patterson claimed to have seen large footsteps earlier in the week and convinced Gimlin to go on a journey with him. When the two returned to the area where Patterson had originally found the prints, they were washed away due to rain. Still, the two men trekked deep into the woods on horseback. Then out of nowhere, Patterson's horse started jumping around, and then they saw it. Bigfoot on the other side of a creek. Patterson reached for his camera and started to record, but as he got closer, he tripped on some sticks. The noise got the attention of Bigfoot, who made eye contact with the men and then kept walking deeper into the woods, as you could see on the footage.
When I first saw her, she was standing upright. I thought, you know, this is unreal.
To this day, there's still a debate about whether or not the footage is real, and Gimlin doesn't seem to care to make people believe him. He knows what he saw on that day.
Starting us off at number 10 is the Devil's Bible, also known as the Codex Gigas. Back in the 13th century, there was a monk who was sentenced to be walled up alive because he broke his sacred vows. Obviously, this guy wasn't a fan of dying, so what did he do? He promised the monastery that if they let him live, he would write a book that would contain all human knowledge in a day. Yikes, that might be worse than death. In order to fulfill his promise, he sold his soul to the devil himself. Supposedly, this Devil's Bible contained a complete Latin translation of the Bible and multiple other texts, such as medical formulas and even instructions for performing exorcisms. This book was created using more than 160 animal skins and apparently takes 2 people just to lift it. Although, mysteriously, this book became a bit lighter because 12 pages are actually missing. Rumor has it, these pages contain satanic rituals to summon the devil himself. Of course, there is no way in knowing unless we read it for ourselves, so if any of you hardcore readers out there get a chance to take a peek, let me know in the comments. Coming in at number 9 is the Nazca Lines. Most of us have heard of crop circles before, but what about the Nazca Lines? The Nazca Lines, just like crop circles, are actually named geoglyphs. Now, what is a geoglyph? A geoglyph is a large design produced on the ground and usually formed by clastic rocks, stones, stone fragments, and gravel or earth. The Nazca Lines were first discovered in the 1930s when pilots were flying over the Nazca Desert in southern Peru and came across these massive drawings. The ancient Nazca civilization made up these drawings consisting of animals, humans, and plants around 2,000 years ago. There are said to be over 100 of these drawings spanning a total of 50 square kilometers. And while many can identify who and what created these massive drawings, no one alive actually knows the reason behind them. Scholars theorize that these were massive signs to give incoming sailors directions, or that they were a way to communicate with those above us. Dun dun dun! Here at number 8 we have the Roman dodecahedrons. All over the world for hundreds of years, random stone and bronze objects have been popping up in fields and sometimes even in people's yards. These objects are called the Roman dodecahedrons. These objects have 12 sides with a small circle on each and pegs sticking out of every single corner. Experts have dated these objects all the way back to the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, but once again, they have no idea of their purpose. Many believe these objects resemble an ancient nautical devices, or were used to sow winter grains or even calibrate water pipes for Roman architects. In the end, all of these are just theories and cannot be told for sure. So maybe go and invest in a metal detector and see what you can find. At number 7 we have the King List. Dating all the way back to the 3rd millennium BCE, this giant slab known as the King List lists all of the Sumerian kings with their respective dynasties, locations, and the times they were in power. This may not seem like much of a mystery to you, but the mystery isn't the list of the Sumerian kings on the slab, but what is actually included in the list of kings. There are mythological events inscribed on the slab, as well as the events of the Great Flood and the Tales of Gilgamesh, meaning that the stories from the Old Testament could indeed be true and that the kings included on the list were actually gods or demigods. Hopefully all that power didn't go to their heads. At number 6 we have the Antikythera mechanism. Back in 1900, a group of sponge divers discovered a shipwreck in the Mediterranean dating all the way back to 70 to 60 BCE. These divers salvaged 3 pieces of bronze making up what is now known as the Antikythera mechanism. This shoebox-sized artifact stunned scholars for over a century due to the fact that the object's gears and internal mechanisms were far beyond any of the known Greek tech of the time. Some even believe that this object is proof of ancient aliens' visitations to Earth. Although in the late 20th century, X-ray X-rays showed that the object is designed to track astronomical movements and was confirmed later by CT scans that revealed inscriptions for what was basically an ancient computer. While the object's use has now been confirmed, what is still puzzling is the advanced construction and precision of this tool that is believed to be way more advanced than what was available at the time. I don't know. If you ask me, I say aliens. At number 5, we have the stone spheres of Costa Rica. Ever since the 1940s, scientists have been digging up these ancient mysterious spheres in the Dicus Delta of Costa Rica. Originally discovered by agricultural forays by the United Fruit Company, small stone spheres ranging from a few centimeters wide to 2 meters in diameter and weighing over 16 tons have been popping up everywhere in the Dicus Delta. Every single one of these spheres is man-made and made up of an igneous stone known as granodiorite. Many of these stone spheres have been moved to high-profile locations throughout Costa Rica, and some are even now privately owned. Everyone seems to love them for their decoration, but the coolest thing about them is that absolutely no one knows why, how, or who made these strange objects. Seems to be a common theme, huh? At number 4, we have the bog bodies of Northern Europe. Ever since the 18th century, hundreds and hundreds of well-preserved human bodies have been discovered in the peat bogs of Northern Europe. Some of these bodies have been dated all the way back to 8000 BCE. Some of you may be familiar with the famous Toland man, who was discovered back in 1950 by 2 Danish farmers in a small town in Denmark. The Toland man is believed to be from the pre-Roman Iron Age of the 3rd century BCE. His body was so well preserved that scientists were able to look at the contents of his stomach to determine where he lived. Now, I know what you're thinking. Dewey, this sounds amazingly gross and cool, but where's the mystery, my dude? Well, I'm glad you asked. All of the bodies that have been found have no explanation as to why they were placed in the bogs, nor why this way of disposal would be utilized. There are only speculations that these people were either sacrifices or social outcasts who were fated to meet their doom. Wow. And I thought high school kids were mean. Coming in at number 3 is the underwater ruins of Japan. Just under the surface off the coast of Yonaguni-jima is Japan's very own Atlantis. First discovered back in 1995, divers and researchers believed the findings to be nothing more than just a series of weird rock formations that included straight lines and right angles. Later, there were researchers that discovered a large stone gateway, carved stairways, and streets to huge vaulting towers. Many believe the underwater mystery to be the fallen city of the Jomon people. Experts believe that the city didn't fall into the sea like other fabled underwater cities, but actually slowly submerged over thousands of years. It is believed that this site could hold secrets and answers to all of the other theorized underwater cities around the world, such as Atlantis. Now, we could continue to theorize, or we could just believe that Aquaman, starring Jason Momoa, is actually a documentary and he currently does live in the ocean. I could see it. At number 2, we have the Piri Reis map. In 1929, this old map was found in the Sultan's palace in Istanbul, Turkey. A legendary commander of the Ottoman fleet by the name of Piri Reis, who lived from 1465 to 1553, is the author of the map. Reis's map is extremely precise. So precise that it actually includes the continent of Antarctica. But wait, hold the phone. Antarctica wasn't discovered until 1773 by British Captain James Cook. But yet, here is Piri Reis's map showing Antarctica back in 1513. Was Antarctica actually just discovered much earlier than originally thought? Or did James Cook just take credit for someone else's hard work? We might never know. Finally, coming in at number 1 is the infamous Big Daddy Stonehenge. In case you've been living under a prehistoric rock for the last few thousand years, you've probably heard of Stonehenge. Stonehenge is a giant prehistoric monument that is located in England and dates back to 3000 BC. The monument consists of a ring of standing stones all weighing around 25 ton, originally from a quarry located 25 kilometers or 15.53 miles away from the current monument. Not one person knows how these ancient people could have moved these massive stones without the use of a wheel or pulley, or why they were even formed in the first place. Is it an ancient observatory? Healing place? Did ancient aliens create it as a landing pad? We may never actually know.
Alright, coming in at number 10, we have the Beale Ciphers. This is an old American tale that seems too good to be true, but it still has people trying to hunt down this mysterious treasure to get rich. The Beale Ciphers were made in the 1920s in Virginia. Now, they were a secret that was passed to an innkeeper, or so the legend goes. They were apparently written by a man named Thomas J. Beale. That's obviously where the name comes from. Now, when Thomas gave these ciphers to the innkeeper, it wasn't some challenge to see if the innkeeper had had the skills to unearth the riches? No, he said he was gonna come back to get the papers from the dude, but then he disappeared, and that was the last time anyone saw him. So the innkeeper sat on these papers for 23 years before he had to crack them open to see what was inside. Turns out it was a bunch of codes that the innkeeper couldn't crack. Before he died, he passed those codes off to another man who was able to crack one of the 3 codes. This code broke down what was actually in the treasure, which was apparently $43 million worth of gold and silver, and that's $43 million in today's currency. Now apparently the other 2 codes tell you who the treasure belongs to and where the treasure actually is. So one of those codes is absolutely useless. I'll tell you, if I crack that code, that treasure belongs to me. Also, there's a good chance that either Beale went back to get the treasure himself and didn't tell the innkeeper because the ciphers would have been useless if he moved the treasure, or there could have been someone else who cracked the code and has already been there to take the treasure and didn't tell anyone. Like, if I cracked that code, the last thing I would do would be blab about it. I would be real quiet about it. I would take my treasure and then I would flip it into cash and no one would be the wiser. Coming in at number 9, we have WT1190F. That sounds like a code you put in to have unlimited ammo in one of the Doom games, but this is a much more interesting find. WT1190F was some space debris that had people all over the world confused about what was going on. People at NASA, as well as several other space agencies around the world, could not figure out what the hell that was or where it came from. And when we're talking about the massive void known as space, it would seem that it really could have come from anywhere. The debris eventually entered the atmosphere and burned up upon entry, so whatever it is, it's gone now. The suspicion is that it could have been something released from a spacecraft, but then the question becomes, which one? And guys, make sure you hit that like button because it really helps us out. Coming in at number 8, we have the Bay of Jars. We know that Europeans did not come to Brazil until the 1500s, and it's thought that those were the first people to cross the ocean to touch this new continent. That was until 200 Roman jars were found on a beach in Brazil. Treasure hunter Robert Marks was exploring Guanabara Bay in Brazil to see if he could come up with any goods. Well, he would find more than some gold coins or a treasure map. He would unearth 200 Roman jars that might change the Brazilian history. This was back in 1982, and soon after the discovery, the bay was closed to stop thieves from coming through and stealing these priceless artifacts. Since then, no one has been able to find out how these jars got there. As far as we know, the Romans never crossed the ocean to make contact with the Americas, but maybe one ship was brave enough to make the journey and ended up docked in Brazil with a ton of goods and no one to trade with. There's also the possibility that these were brought over by colonizing Europeans who wanted to sneak away to the New World with a treasure that could change their life. There are suspicions that the Brazilian government isn't interested in finding out why these jars are there because it would shift the narrative of Brazilian history, and they are happy with things the way that they are. Coming in at number 7, we have Jack the Ripper. We have talked about Jack the Ripper many times on this channel before. This was the man responsible for terrorizing the streets of London back in 1888. He had the whole city on edge because people thought at any moment they could be descended upon by a man in a black coat who would slice them up like a Thanksgiving turkey. This all started when there was a series of women who all turned up dead in the streets. They all died in similar ways. There were slash marks through their throat from ear to ear, and all of them had been dissected with some of their organs removed. Now, the term serial killer wasn't even coined yet, so the idea that someone was going around and simply dismembering people for some sort of sick amusement was shocking to the public. And because these victims were all prostitutes, it made Scotland Yard think that these could have been crimes of passion. Then the police force would receive a letter entitled From Hell. This would be the first contact from the brutal killer who would call himself Jack the Ripper. The gruesome letter talked about his killings and also was taunting the police. Even at this point, the men at Scotland Yard were hard pressed to try and find a way to connect this back to a single person. For all they knew, this letter was sent from the newspaper so they could drum up a little business. But then they got one more letter that had a human kidney with it. I think Jack wanted them to know that he wasn't messing around. To this day, we still have no idea who he is. Coming at number 6, we have the disappearance of Angela Hammond, one of the many missing person cases that has never been solved. Angela Hammond was talking on a payphone with her boyfriend back in 1990. She screamed at the top of her lungs right after she described a green pickup truck that had pulled up next to her. Her boyfriend sped off to where she said she was and saw the pickup truck. He slammed his car into reverse, but then he blew the transmission and the truck got away. No one ever found out who took Angela Hammond. Coming in at number 5, we have the sleeping sickness pandemic. As many of you know, COVID-19 isn't the first time that we've had a pandemic sweep across the world. There have been plenty before the one we are currently dealing with, but one you might not have heard of was encephalitis lethargica, which passed through most of Europe back in 1916. It was a strange illness that doctors never found out how to treat or how people were contracting it. It had a fatality rate of 33%, and even if you were one of the lucky ones who could make it through this mysterious sleeping spell, you might never be the same again, as it's thought it would cause long-lasting brain damage. Basically, it would start with someone getting very tired, like they have mono. This would progressively get worse until they felt like they could no longer work and needed to stay in bed. Eventually, they would fall asleep and drift into a coma. Some people would never wake up from said coma. The last case of this was in the 1930s, but we still have no idea what the sickness was or where it came from or how to treat it. I'm sure if it came around today, we would have the tech to solve this problem, but this is still very much a creepy one. Coming in at number 4, we have the dancing plague. Might as well stack one pandemic on top of another one, get them all out of the way so we can have smooth sailing from here on out. The dancing plague was back in 1518, and it started with just one lady who was busting it down and some more people jumped in until there were over 400 people dancing around. This sounds like what's going to happen in the streets as soon as all the coronavirus bans are lifted. Well, the rumor is the dancing lasted for weeks and some people danced to death. Now, there isn't any hard evidence to prove that people died from dancing, but people definitely did dance for weeks. Some of the suggested reasons why: psychedelic mushrooms. Spores were released into the airs, everyone started tripping, and they had to bust a move. Coming in at number 3, we have Cleopatra's tomb. One of the most famous rulers in history was buried with the one she loved, Mark Anthony, not the singer. You guys can get all those jokes out of your system now. But is J-Lo the reincarnation of Cleopatra? Probably. Back to history. Cleopatra was apparently buried somewhere near the temple of Isis, as people loved her as much as they respected the Egyptian god. Now, outside of her tomb being a great archaeological find, because we know how much old dudes love finding dead bodies wrapped in toilet paper, there's something much more valuable than a queen that has been dead for over 2,000 years. Apparently, the tomb is filled with gold and jewels. Now, there is a chance that this tomb has already been raided and there won't be anything worthwhile in it, but if it's still intact, cracking this thing open would make you rich beyond your wildest dreams. But if you're pulling this one off, everyone around you might want a piece of the pie unless you have the skills to dig up the tomb on your own. So you might have to pull off a Scooby-Doo thing where you pretend to be a fake monster so you can scare everyone off and get the riches to yourself. Coming in at number 2, we have what's going on in the ocean. This is one of the biggest mysteries on the planet. We know more about the surface of the moon than we do about what's going on below in the ocean. I mean, we have explored a good amount of it, but there's still so much we don't know, and we are kind of destroying that environment, so if we don't start looking into it soon, we might lose it forever and never get those answers. And if there are evil mermaids down there, they might be gearing up to go to war with us for all the things we've been doing to the ocean. And coming at the number 1 spot is quantum entanglement. Now, I want to start off this point by saying that I am too stupid to know what this is. I think I have an idea of what it is, and that's why I'm putting it on this list, but if I get this very wrong, please feel free to correct me in the comments. Now, quantum entanglement is how a particle can be affected by another particle that is nowhere near it. Now, why is this strange? Because what we understand as physics is that two particles that aren't close to each other shouldn't be able to affect one another, and if they could, they would have some means of communication that is faster than the speed of light, which is also thought to be impossible. Now, scientists have witnessed this happen, but they have no explanation as to why it's happening. So this breaks the laws of physics, and we don't know why.
Starting off this countdown, we have the USS Cyclops. On February 16th, 1918, the US Cyclops set out to Baltimore, Maryland from Rio. It was estimated to arrive on March 13th, but it never made it there. The ship and all the 306 members on board disappeared without a trace. The ship was never found, nor were any of the bodies. Now there's a lot of things here that don't make sense. For example, how could the biggest ship in the US Navy disappear without a trace? Number 2, if they were in trouble, why didn't they send an SOS signal? And why were there no pieces of wreckage found? As described by the Santa Fe magazine, they said, and I quote, "Usually a wooden bucket or a cork life preserver identified as belonging to a lost ship is picked up after a wreck, but not so with the Cyclops. There was just nothing left behind." It was a very weird and eerie case. Moving on at number 9, we have the Flannan Isle Lighthouse Keepers. On December 7th, 1900, 3 lighthouse keepers took their spot in Flannan Isle to do a 2-week shift. However, when the boat returned to collect them after their shift, they were nowhere to be found. They disappeared under very weird circumstances. For example, when they got to the lighthouse, it was locked. Inside, the clock had randomly stopped working. All their gear was left inside, and there was a meal on the table ready to be eaten. However, their bodies were never found. One other eerie thing would be the lighthouse keeper's journal entries. In one entry, he wrote about how one keeper was acting weird and all quiet. The other keeper was apparently crying for some reason. Now, some believe that the men were outside trying to secure something and then they got blown over the cliff, or a wave maybe washed them out to sea. Maybe they ran out in a panic and that's why they left their gear inside. Whereas others believe the men were killed and tossed out to sea, or even kidnapped by aliens. But whatever truly happened to them is still unknown. In our 8th spot, we have the Isdal woman. In 1970, a mysterious woman was found burned to death in Ice Valley, Norway. We don't know who she is, and it seems like someone didn't want us to find out. Why? Well, all the labels were cut off of her clothes, and distinctive marks were scraped off of her belongings. It gets weirder when police found that she had a number of fake passports and disguises like wigs. She also had notebook entries that were all in code, so it may be that she was some sort of foreign spy. But to this day, police haven't cracked this case. There have been some breakthroughs over the years, but nothing solid to help us identify this woman. We don't know what happened to her, what she was doing, and who her killer is. In our 7th spot, we have the Watcher. In 2014, a family bought a $1.3 million home in New Jersey. Little did they know that the home came with a lot of baggage, including a creepy stalker who called themselves the Watcher. Before even moving in, they began to receive letters from the Watcher. These letters talked about what the family was doing, proving to them that someone was truly watching them and stalking their every move. Some things that this Watcher said in the letters were, and I quote, "This home has been the subject of my family for decades. I have been put in charge of watching and waiting for its second coming." And then another letter referred to the new owner's children and asked, have they found out what's in the walls yet? Which made the family terrified, thinking that there was some listening device or, security cameras hidden in the walls. The family ended up hiring investigators and set up cameras, but the Watcher was never caught. As a result, they decided to move out of their home and sell it for a loss. But what about the new buyers? Like, do you have to put in house comes with creepy stalker in the house listing or what? I'm thinking that this was just some ploy for a guy to get $1 million home for cheap. Like he torments everyone who lives there so no one wants to buy the house, and then someone sells it for cheap and he gets it for a steal. Did I just solve this case? I think I did. Coming in at number 6, we have Septic Tank Sam. Septic Tank Sam is the name given to an unidentified man found in a septic tank in Alberta, Canada. So the year was 1977, and a couple went out to an abandoned farmhouse to find a pump for their septic tank. However, when they opened the tank, they found a decomposed body of a man. According to police, it was a very gruesome and sadistic crime scene. The man had been tied, tortured, burned, and shot before being dumped in the tank. The remains were in such bad condition that the examiner took months to figure out if the body belonged to a man or a woman. Eventually, it was discovered to be of a man. His teeth records were then sent to over over 800 dentists, but there were no matches whatsoever. It's a very sad case, and I hope one day we can figure out who this man is and who his killer was. We're now at our 5th and halfway mark with the man from Torrid. This case is fairly creepy and might prove that time travel or multiple dimensions are real. So in July of 1954, a well-dressed man arrived at the Haneda airport in Tokyo, Japan. Nothing was odd about this man until he was questioned by the customs officer. The man then claimed that he was from Torrid, and it was his 3rd time visiting Japan from his country. However, there is no country named Torrid. His documents, like his passport and IDs, were all authentic, but it said that he was from this mysterious place called Torrid. They eventually took him into custody for further interrogation, thinking that he was lying and he's some criminal. He was then placed in a hotel room that had only one entry and one exit point. That was monitored by 2 guards. But somehow, this man mysteriously vanished. The thing was, he was put up in a room high up in a hotel with no balcony. There's no way he could have escaped. Now, some people think that Torrid is a real country, but just in a different universe, and that this man somehow passed through a parallel dimension and ended up at the airport, the wrong airport. Whereas others believe that he is a time traveler who mistakenly landed at the airport. In our 4th spot, we have the UFOologist. Who here believes in aliens? If you do, hit that like button. Well, Max Spears certainly did. Max Spears was a ufologist as well as a conspiracy theorist. In July of 2016, he went to Poland to attend a conference to speak about secret military programs. On July 16th, he was at a friend's place when he passed out on her couch and stopped breathing. Here's the scary part. Just days before his death, Max told his mom, and I quote, "If anything happens to me, investigate." He also told her that he felt like he was going to get murdered. But the police officer that investigated the scene said he died of natural causes, and no examination or further investigation was conducted. Apparently, he overdosed on anti-anxiety drugs. But many people believe that there's more to this story than just that, especially since he dies only a couple of days after he said he was going to get murdered. Also, he was closing in on details about UFOs. Did someone kill him over this? It's all pretty freaky, am I right? Coming in at number 3, we have the double identity. So once upon a time, there was a man named Lawrence, or Larry Batter. He was a cookware salesman from Ohio. But on March 15th, 1957, he went out for a fishing trip and never returned home. It was deemed that he got lost at sea. He was declared dead in 1960. Here's the thing though, after Larry's disappearance, a man named John Fritz appeared in Nebraska. He became a radio station announcer and soon a local TV personality. John Fritz looked exactly like Larry Batter. In 1965, someone from Ohio recognized John as Larry, but John had no idea who Larry was and no memory of his life. Psychiatrists even examined him and deemed that he was not lying. But after running tests, his fingerprints were the same as Larry's. So John was Larry. I know, it's confusing. So here's a couple of theories. A, he faked his own death and started a new life in Nebraska. Number 2, he suffered from dissociative amnesia and genuinely forgot who he was. Sadly, he passed away in 1966 and his case was never solved. Or maybe Larry had a twin brother. Ever think of that? Come on, guys. In our 2nd spot, we have the Oakville rain blobs. In August of 1994, something weird fell from the skies in Oakville, Washington. At first, people thought it was just rain, but no, it was definitely not water. It was like these strange, clear blobs. One person reported that it was very mushy, almost like jello. This mysterious substance rained down 6 times over a 3-week period. And guess what? Anyone exposed to that substance became very ill. One resident had difficulty breathing, blurred vision, intense nausea, and vertigo. Another resident said that everyone in town contracted a flu-like illness that lasted 2 to 3 months. And sadly, several cats and dogs exposed to the substance became ill and passed away. Upon inspecting the substance, it apparently contained human white blood cells. But to this day, no one knows what it is or what caused it. And in our number 1 spot, we have the Toxic Lady. This next story is going to shock you. It's probably the craziest one on this list. So on February 19th, 1994, at 8:15 at night, a woman named Gloria Ramirez was wheeled into the emergency room in a hospital in the Southern California city of Riverside. She was only 31 years old, but her blood pressure was very low. She could barely breathe and her heart was beating very very fast. Medical staff started helping her right away. Things got weird. For starters, her body was covered in a weird oily sheen, and her breath had a fruity, garlicky scent to it. The blood then took some of her blood and realized weird particles floating in her blood. The weirdest part, after taking her blood, they noticed a weird smell emitting from the blood and her body. After getting a whiff of her blood, hospital staff became very ill and started dropping. In the end, 23 of the 37 emergency room staff became sick from Gloria. 5 had to be hospitalized for the rest of the night. 1 was severely ill and spent 2 weeks in the ICU. Hence why they gave her the name the Toxic Lady. Sadly, they weren't able to save Gloria's life. Now, what was wrong with Gloria, and how come she made so many people sick with her blood? Well, there are a couple of theories out there. One is that Gloria used something called DMSO to help her cervical cancer. DMSO is toxic, but back in the day, it was marketed as a cure-all, like it will cure your pain, anxiety, you name it. Now, when the MDSO is exposed to oxygen, it converts to dimethyl sulfate. As a gas, dimethyl sulfate vapors destroy cells in people's eyes, lungs, and mouth. When it gets in the body, it can cause convulsions, delirium, you name it. Although Gloria's family denies that she used DMSO, this is one explanation to why others got sick when exposed to her.
Coming in at number 10, we have ACT. If I were to tell you that the Australian cultural terrorists were a real thing and they pulled off one of the greatest art heists in history, you would think that's probably true because everything on this channel is a strange fact that you were unaware of. Well, if you thought that, then good, because I'm going to tell you about the time that the Australian cultural terrorists stole Pablo Picasso's famous painting, The Weeping Woman. The year was 1986, and the painting was being housed in the National Art Gallery of Victoria. Then one day it was just gone. To this day, no one knows how the painting was stolen, but get this, it took 2 days for them to realize it was gone. Could you imagine owning something worth $1.2 million and having it stolen, and then not cluing in until the weekend was over? Well, all that was left in the painting's place was a note that said ACT. This was the first attack of the Australian cultural terrorists, and soon the Melbourne police station will receive a series of ransom notes that were demanding more funding for the arts in Australia. Wait, what? I've never heard of something so noble and selfish all in one sentence, because you're not stealing an extremely expensive painting for yourself, you're stealing it to improve society. But that's where you start? You want funding for the arts instead of impoverished communities? This heist sounds like it was pulled off by the rich kid whose dad owns the gallery. And to back up my point even further, this heist was pulled off on August 2nd, and by August 19th, an anonymous tip led the police to Spencer Station, where the painting was found in a locker. So you pulled off a ransom heist and you didn't even have the gall to hold onto the painting for 3 weeks? The Australian government never gave in to their demands. The thieves just got too tired of this ransom business. I guess their love for the arts was just a summer fling. Coming in at number 9, we have the Smith girls. Sometimes you need to take a moment and be thankful for your life. This story is a perfect example of why. For many of us, things could have gone so much worse. This story is about Pepper and Renee Smith. The year was 1973, and their mother was having serious health problems with her current pregnancy. She was a single mom, so she hired a babysitter to take care of her girls, and one day she came back from the hospital and they were gone. She went on a massive search for her girls, but she could never find them. It wasn't until 2011 when a tip sent her in the right direction. She heard about 2 girls who had been stolen by their babysitter at ages 3 and 5. These girls were trafficked across America and held captive until they were teenagers. They were later able to get free and started working odd jobs until they were able to find their birth records and start searching for their mom. Sure enough, these 2 girls were her daughters, and the family was reunited. Coming in at number 8, we have what happened to David Lee Miles. One day, David Lee Miles just went missing. His car was missing, so it seemed that he had just got up and left. An investigation was launched, but there was no sign of him anywhere. There was a lot of theories thrown around. Some said he could have been on the run. Other people thought that maybe he was murdered in his car and someone disposed of the vehicle. But the logical answer was that David was 72 years old and had been fighting a losing battle with cancer for a long time. It was thought that he might have taken his own life. And then 9 years later, a tip led police to a lake in Michigan where they found his car with his skeleton resting in it. They were able to identify him by his ID that was left in the passenger seat. Coming in at number 7, we have Grateful Dead. If a body is found and it has been damaged to the point where no one can tell who it is, and there's no ID on the body and no DNA in the system to trace back to the person, then it can be pretty hard to identify that body. Well, that's what happened to someone who was driving back from a Grateful Dead concert in 1995 who died in a car accident. No one could find out who this person was, but police used face reconstruction technology to build his face and post a picture on a website called Web Sleuths. The picture got anonymously posted on Facebook in an attempt to get it out to more people, and eventually his family saw it and sent in DNA samples, and it turns out this was Jason Callahan. His family thought he had run away to start his own life. Coming in at number 6, we have anonymous Twitter help. A brutal hate crime was committed in Philadelphia on 2 gay men that left one of them in the hospital. There was surveillance footage, but no one could find out who these attackers were. The police were looking for answers, and someone on Twitter posted a link to a video. And through some group internet sleuthing, people were able to find a picture of the attackers eating at a restaurant that was extremely close to where the attack took place, and then these people were found and arrested. Coming in at number 5, we have random Reddit help. A very strange post was thrown up on a Reddit forum that asked the Reddit community to help solve a mystery. A person living alone in an apartment kept waking up to find sticky notes all over his room with strange messages on them. He thought someone had been breaking in and leaving them behind while he was sleeping. An anonymous person commented on the post and said there might have been overly high CO levels in the apartment. This can cause sleepwalking and hallucinations. The poster checked the CO levels, and it turns out this was the cause. Coming in at number 4, we have Tammy Jo Alexander, a very mysterious case that is only half solved, but maybe talking about it here will help us get one step closer. A body of a girl was found in New York without any clues as to who left it there. No one could find out who this person was, and the reason would be uncovered 36 years later. When some anonymous people on the website Web Sleuths started looking into the case, they found that this was the body of a 16-year-old girl named Tammy Jo Alexander who went missing from Florida. Well, they've got this far now, but now it's time to find out how her body ended up there and who killed her. Coming in at number 3, we have the hitchhiker. I don't really think this happens much anymore, but hitchhikers used to be a very common thing, and most of the time it was just people trying to get around, but some of them really wanted people dead. Charles Holden was approached by a man on the street who said he needed a ride to a hospital. He said it was an emergency. Charles was suspicious of the man and didn't want to drive all the way to the hospital because he said he was close to home. Eventually, Charles drove him partway, but when he stopped, the man threatened to kill Charles if he didn't drive him all the way. He convinced the man to step out of his car for a moment, and then he drove away. But then when Charles returned home, he saw the dude lurking outside of his apartment. He called the cops, but by the time they got there, the man had worked his way into the back of the house, broke in, and murdered his mother. Cops couldn't find this man, and it wasn't until 17 years later when a tip set the cops in the right direction, and they were able to find the killer, who would later be sentenced to life in prison. Coming in at number 2, we have the Chicago triple murder. Okay, let's jet back to the year 1955. Everything looks old-timey and people wear suits all the time. Also, there was some murder happening. The city was Chicago and the month was October. 3 young boys were found dead, all buried together. This launched one of the biggest manhunts in Chicago history, but there wasn't much to go on. The boys had gone downtown to watch a movie, and on their way home someone had spotted the boys hitchhiking. Never get into a car with a stranger. Well, no one says what vehicle the boys got into, and then the case went cold, and it would stay cold for nearly 40 years. It wasn't until the FBI was investigating another case and they got a tip about the Chicago case that was lost in time. The tip pointed towards Kenneth Hansen, and after a thorough investigation, it was discovered that Hansen did in fact commit this crime, and he was given a sentence of 210 years. He would later die in prison. And for the number 1 spot, we have Raina Marroquin. Sometimes an anonymous tip can come from someone who isn't even alive. For this story, we have to head over to the year 1999 and set our feet down in New York. A new home was purchased, and the previous owner left behind something that probably should have been disposed of quite a while ago. It was a giant oil drum, and inside the oil drum was a dead body that had been in there for 30 years. But here's where the tip comes in. There was an address book in the drum that revealed to investigators that the body belonged to Raina Marroquin. They found out that she had gone missing 30 years ago and was working for a company called Melrose Plastic. The owner of the company was Howard Elkins. This is where the story gets even crazier. When Marroquin's body was found, it was discovered that she was 9 months pregnant. A DNA test was ordered to see if Elkins' DNA matched the baby. Elkins committed suicide before the results came out, but the baby was in fact his.
Starting us off for number 10 is Gayle Raubel. I feel like this story was really lost in time and deserves a lot more attention than it got. Now, Gayle was Hitler's half-niece and became his housekeeper in 1925. But their relationship was super weird. Despite being related and being 19 years younger than Hitler, they had a weird, possessive, sexual relationship. They spent the next 6 years in this weird relationship, and it was clear he had a lot of control over her actions. When he found out she was having an affair with his chauffeur, he forced her to end it and then had her chaperoned at all times. By 1930, she wanted to go to Vienna to continue her singing lessons and marry someone from Linz, but Hitler forbade it. The two had a heated argument in September of 1931, and then he departed for a meeting in Nuremberg. That night, Gailey killed herself with Hitler's pistol, and he was recalled back to Munich. But it's unclear whether the death was a suicide or a murder, because when her body was found, she had a fractured nose and numerous other injuries other than the gunshot. And I mean, if she just shot herself, why would she have all these other injuries? Doesn't really make sense. Police ruled out foul play because, let's face it, Hitler controlled them, but controversy erupted ASAP Rocky about Hitler having murdered her, which is fair enough. But that was also quickly silenced because of the Nazis' political influence and the fact they'll probably kill you if you talk A journalist investigating her death was arrested before publishing his findings and then executed. Ironically, Hitler actually said she was the only woman he had ever loved. A Vanity Fair article published in 1992 speculated that maybe he accidentally shot her or she was killed on his orders, since apparently she was pregnant with his child and he was not happy about it. So there's definitely motive. Also, can we just, how ridiculous is that? How do you accidentally shoot someone? Okay. Coming in at number 9 is the Gregory affair, and this family affair has a lot of twists and turns, so I mean, pay attention, people. Back in October of 1984, 4-year-old Gregory Villeman was playing in the front yard of his house in France while his mum did some laundry. 15 minutes pass and the boy is now nowhere to be found, and his uncle receives an anonymous call saying the boy was thrown into the Vologne River. His body was later found in the river with a hat pulled over his face and his hands and feet bound with rope. Now, let's just quickly hit you with some backstory. During the years before the murder, the Villeman family had been receiving many anonymous calls and letters from a male who wanted revenge against Gregory's dad, Jean-Marie. After his murder, the family got a letter saying, "I have taken vengeance." Now here's where it gets messy. Jean-Marie's cousin Bernard was implicated for the murder based on handwriting experts and was taken into custody. He denied any involvement, but Jean-Marie promised in front of a bunch of press that he would kill Bernard. When he was released, Jean-Marie shot him as he was leaving for work and then was sent to jail for murder. Didn't really think that one through, did you? While that was going on, Gregory's mom was then identified as the one writing all the letters, and then she was charged with a murder and then cleared of the charges 7 years later. This is like Keeping Up with the Kardashians, but it's like the Villemans. The case stayed cold till 2000 when DNA testing reopened it and implicated 3 more family members: the great aunt and uncle and another aunt. So at this point, half the family has been implicated in the murder with no conclusion, and no one knows who killed the boys still. Keeping Up with the Villemans. I would watch that. At number 8 we have the Jameson family. Now this family of 3 suspiciously disappeared on the 8th of October in 2009, but the whole thing was just majorly sus. The family's pickup truck was found a few days into them being missing and it was abandoned. Their malnourished dog was found inside along with their IDs, their phones, their wallets and $32,000 in cash. But apparently that was all good because the family was known to carry huge amounts of cash with them, which again, I don't know why anyone didn't question that. That is weird. Many theories came out about the case that perhaps the family had faked their own deaths and were now in the witness protection program. This came up because the father, Bobby, was in a lawsuit against his dad, Bob, because he'd apparently threatened Bobby and hit him with a car. Others say the family was involved in drug dealing because of all the cash that they always had, and that perhaps they were drug addicts that had just lost the plot. On the other hand, the couple had visited their pastor on multiple occasions, telling him they had seen spirits and apparitions inside their home, so maybe they were possessed. I don't know. Others even think it was a group suicide. There's just a lot going on and I don't know who to believe. The remains were found 4 years later and were correctly identified as the 3 family members. Still no idea what the hell happened though. Filling our number 7 slot is the ghost blimp. Now back in the summer of 1942, the locals of San Francisco saw something bizarre in the sky. They witnessed a sagging broken blimp falling to earth. On its way down, it stopped on a rooftop and then took down a bunch of power lines and damaged the nearby area quite a bit. After watching it fall for what seemed like ages, when it finally landed, locals ran to help the crew inside, only to find out that no one was manning the blimp. Everything inside looked normal-ish. The engine had been smashed on impact, the propellers were bent, and gas was leaking into the street, but the lifeboats and parachutes hadn't been used, so where the hell was the crew? The blimp had left the naval station that morning with Lieutenant Ernest Cody and Ensign Charles Adams on board, yet the duo were never seen again. The Navy were adamant the men wouldn't leave the blimp voluntarily, so they theorized that perhaps the gondola door malfunctioned and one of them fell out and the other tried to steer the ship down to the water to save him and then fell out as well. Seems like a very unlikely story, but sure, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. Not. Now at number 6 is Walter Collins. Now back in the late 1920s, Christina Ida Collins made headlines after her 9-year-old son Walter went missing. He went to the cinema one day and never came home, and his disappearance was huge in LA. Hundreds and hundreds of leads came in that the police followed up, but to no avail until 5 months later when they found a boy in Illinois claiming to be Walter. Christine was shown a bunch of photos and letters from Walter before bringing him home, but upon his arrival in LA, Christine claimed that the boy wasn't her son. And you are not the mother, and he is not your son. The officer told her to take him home and see and try him out, but she came back 3 weeks later saying it wasn't her son and she had dental records to back up her claim. The police thought she was just trying to embarrass them and accused her of being a bad mother, so much so that they got her committed to a psych ward for being difficult or an inconvenience. After screwing her the hell over, the officer in charge interviewed Walter, who admitted he was actually 12-year-old Arthur Hutchins Jr., a runaway boy. He was hoping posing as Walter would allow him to go to LA to meet his favorite actor. That's just not really how it works, Arthur. Christine was released 10 days after his confessions, and Gordon Stewart Northcutt, the man guilty for the Wineville chicken coop murders, was suspected as Walter's murderer. And that was because Gordon's mum said she helped her son kill Walter, but he was never brought to trial for Walter's murder, and Christine still believed he was alive somewhere and looked for him till the day she died. Till this day, we don't know whether Gordon killed him, whether he got abducted by somebody else, whether he just ran away, we just don't know. And also, drinking game, how many times did I say Walter in that bloody paragraph? Walter, 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 like shut up, Eamon. Coming in at number 5 is Jodine Serin. Now Jodine was a 39-year-old woman that had been diagnosed with schizophrenia along with multiple other mental disabilities. She was still a very high-functioning individual and she lived alone in an apartment in Carlsbad. Her parents went to check up on her on Valentine's Day back in 2007, and they walked in on what they thought was a funnily awkward scene. They caught Jodine in bed having sex with who they assumed was a boyfriend. I don't know, maybe you just want to sleep around, maybe it's not a boyfriend. We don't shame Jodine. Either way, the parents told them to get dressed, assuming an embarrassed couple would soon come out of the room, but they were quite wrong. After waiting quite a while, they checked in on them again and realized the man had escaped without being detected and that Jodine had been strangled to death. She had been beaten and had been dead for at least a day or more before they actually found her. Forensic evidence a decade later confirmed the man in the room that day was not her killer. Autopsy results pointed to blunt force trauma to the head as the cause of death. The case stayed cold for a very long time, but in 2018, David Mabrito was identified through DNA and genetic ancestry as being a possible suspect for her murder. But he committed suicide in 2011, so I guess we'll just never know. At number 4 is the Phantom Barber. Now let me set the scene. Location, Pascagoula, Mississippi. Time, summer of 1942. A contained fear took over the locals of the small coastal town as someone broke into people's homes at night by slitting their window screens. He would go into women's bedrooms and cut off locks of their hair, but that's it. He wouldn't kill them, no one would get hurt, but quite a few women reported the incident. The first 2 incidents were innocent, but the third got violent. The Phantom Barber attacked a sleeping couple by assaulting them with a crowbar, breaking the woman's teeth and knocking the husband completely out. Both survived but could not for the life of them identify the assailant. In the 4th incident, he seemed to have chloroformed his victim and taken her hair, but again, that's it. Retired chemist William Dolan was charged with the attacks when a bundle of hair was found behind his residence. A few years later, he was released after passing a lie detector test, so no one quite knows who this person was. Some still believe it was William behind the incident, some people think it's someone else completely, whereas others just have no clue whatsoever. Which camp do you fall under? Let me know. Filling our number 3 slot is Lars Mittink. Now this one really got me because I simply just don't understand what happened here. So back in July of 2014, Lars went to Golden Sands in Bulgaria with a bunch of friends. Party it up, dude, yeah. And basically a bunch of young people go there for a good time. It's like going to Mallorca or Ibiza. Either way, a few days into the trip, Lars got into a fight with 4 random guys over football because God forbid anyone disrespect a guy's football team. He ended up coming out of the situation with a ruptured eardrum, and doctors told him he wasn't fit to fly home with his friends. Despite his friends offering to stay with him, Lars insisted he'd be fine alone, and they left on their way. He checked into a cheap hotel in Bulgaria, but the day after his friends left, he started acting very weird. He was erratic, he was paranoid, and he texted his mum saying he felt unsafe to cancel his credit card and that he was hiding from 4 men that were apparently following him. And I hope to God it wasn't the same 4 men from the fight before, because I mean, insulting Bayern Munich, it's not that deep, it's really not. Either way, the CCTV footage captured Lars' last moments where he was seen inside Varna airport with his bags. A while later, he can be seen running straight out of the airport without his bags, and then outside the airport he runs to a fence, climbs it, runs into the woods, and has literally never been seen since. Where are you at? No. Now at number 2 are the Devil's Footprints. Now back in February of 1855 in Dover, England, residents of a town woke up to find hoof-like footprints around their homes. The prints were 4 inches long and 3 inches wide and covered 40 to 100 miles of track, which is quite substantial. But the weird thing about it was that the marks were in a single file line, and no 4-legged animal could have produced prints like that. So locals truly believe the devil had come to Dover, because that's clearly the first thing you should think of. The prints just went straight over obstacles like rivers and houses and haystacks, and were even on top of people's houses on their roofs. Some people literally had these prints walking straight up to their front door, and back in the day, all hell freaking broke loose and people were hoping to God it wasn't Satan. They were pointing to hopping mice, or a kangaroo, or badgers, or an experimental balloon. Kangaroos in Dover, England, really. Basically, they were clutching at straws, and no one's figured out what the hell happened since then, so we're just gonna keep it at that. It was a kangaroo, or an experimental balloon. Alright, and I thought I talked a lot of shit. And finally, at number 1 are the lead masked men. Back in August of 1966, 2 corpses were found on Vintum Hill in Rio de Janeiro. The bodies were wearing suits, waterproof coats, and had lead masks over their eyes. Now with their bodies, authorities found towels, water bottles, and a notebook with the instructions 1630 be at agreed place, 1830 swallow capsules, after effect protect metals, wait for mask signal. The men were identified as Manuel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel Jose Viana. The families told authorities they said they were going out to get work supplies, but instead boarded a bus and headed towards Niterói. The 2 stopped at a bar in town where the waitress claimed Miguel seemed especially nervous and was constantly checking his watch. Now no one knows what was in those capsules that both men swallowed, and the toxicology report was inconclusive. The lead masks also made no sense. Like, if they were protecting the men from radiation, fine, but what radiation? Bish aware. 50 years later, we still don't know what the hell that was, and I guess we never will. That's why it's number 1 on this list. Starting us off at number 10 is The Boy in the Box. Back in 1957 in Philadelphia, the case of America's unknown child emerged. The boy was actually found many times before actually being reported to the police. First by a man checking his animal traps, and he refused to report it because he was scared the police would confiscate his traps. Like, hello, priorities, there is a little boy dead there. Forget about your traps. Either way, he was then found by a college student who did end up reporting it the next day. When police finally came to investigate, they found a 4 or 5-year-old naked boy wrapped in a blanket in a cardboard box. His hair had been cut possibly after he died, since clumps of it was still on his body. He was severely malnourished and had suspicious surgical scars on his groin, ankle, and chin. There were bruises all over his body, and a cap and a handkerchief were found near his body, the latter which also had an M engraved onto it. Clues, we like clues. No one came forward with any information, but a psychic psychic led them straight to a foster home nearby. Police started speculating the kid had been the son of the owner's stepdaughter. Perhaps the both of them got rid of his body because the daughter was unwed and so it was just to save her reputation perhaps, because the kid was her son, because I mean it was the 50s, unwed with a baby, that's not a good look, is it? Another theory was that the M could have been a woman called Martha who said her abusive mum had bought the boy from his birth parents 3 years prior. He was abused thoroughly and one night he didn't eat his dinner and so the mum slammed his head against the floor till he became unconscious. She then gave him a bath, during which he died. Martha said she helped her mum dump the body, yet Martha herself had a history of mental illness, so it was hard to believe her story or whether it was even real or if it even happened. So really, we just will never know what happened to the boy in the box. Coming in at number 9 is the incident at Dyatlov Pass. So back in February of 1959, 9 ski hikers went on a trip in the Ural Mountains of present-day Russia. On their last night, they had set up camp near a slope and had had dinner before going to bed. It was a routine trip, yet the group never arrived at their final destination and their fate was never solved. A rescue party was sent out on the 26th and they managed to find the group's tent. It had somehow been ripped open from the inside and the outside of it had footprints everywhere. Some were wearing socks, others were wearing a single shoe, some weren't wearing any shoes at all in the freezing weather, which was just suspicious. The party followed the prints, which led them into finding the first 2 bodies. Both were only wearing underwear and that's literally it. No shoes, no jacket, nothing. Initially, medics thought the cause of death was hypothermia, but as the remaining 7 bodies were found over the next few months, hypothermia just started to make less and less sense. One autopsy showed evidence of blunt force trauma like you'd have in a brutal assault. The person's skull was just completely fractured. 2 of the other bodies had major chest fractures, and to put it into perspective, to cause someone that much damage, the impact would have had to be equivalent to that of a car crash. That is a lot of impact. A lot of damage. Now the 3 bodies had no external wounds to explain their fractured bones, so how did it happen? One of the bodies with the fractured chest was also missing her tongue, eyes and lips. Another body just had a really high level of radiation on their clothes, whilst the rest of the group did actually die of hypothermia. But the reason what rushed the group out of their tents inadequately dressed that morning remains a mystery. Speculations include some kind of UFO attack, an attack from the indigenous Mansi people, and maybe even a military test gone wrong. Who knows? At number 8 we have the satanic beheading. Now back in Feb of 1981, Leroy Carter Jr. was walking through Golden Gate Park looking for a place to sleep. He found a spot near Alvord Lake, got his sleeping bag out and just hit the hay. The next day, police found Carter's body dead, but there was one thing that made his death stand out, and that was he was decapitated. That feature pointed to a ritual or some voodoo being involved in his death, but background investigation into his life showed no links to the occult whatsoever. His neck was sliced through cleanly and a chicken wing and 2 corn cobs were found stuffed into his neck. Around his body, police found the mutilated remains of multiple dead chickens, so a ritualistic sacrifice was all they could think of. After consulting an expert, their theories pointed towards Santeria, which is an Afro-Caribbean religion based on Yoruba traditions and beliefs. Sacrifice plays a major role in their religion, but most rituals involve chickens, not humans, but some underground sects still seek out human victims. After research, investigators figured that the killer had to be back 42 days later to place the head back, and so forces staked out the park as the day approached, yet the killer managed to come and go without being detected. The ritual complete, the culprit was never found, and Leroy's murder was never solved. Filling at number 7 slot are the Salish foot discoveries. This one is just so weird, I don't even get how we haven't figured it out yet, but since the summer of 2007 till now, people have found a total of 20 detached human feet on the coast of the Salish Sea. A Canadian officer claimed that foul play had been ruled out and that the feet must be from either people killed in accidents or by suicide because all the feet had detached via normal decomposition process. Most of the feet were found actually wearing sneakers, which kept them floating and relatively preserved. After the 5th foot was found, the incident started getting a lot more international media attention because, I mean, it's just plain weird. The latest foot that was found was on the 1st of January this year, and they actually did a DNA test and identified the man to have been missing since 2016. So I mean, here's the deal, we're finding a bunch of feet, we don't really know if foul play was involved or not every time, and I suspect we're just going to continue finding these feet, and that's going to be that. Now at number 6 is the story of Pauline Picard. Back in April of 1922, 2-year-old Pauline disappeared from her family farm in France. After search parties yielded no results, Pauline's parents were still hopeful they'd find their baby girl, and they did, or so they thought. Weeks later, a girl matching Pauline's description was seen in Cherbourg, and her mother identified her and went to get her. But after spending 2 hours with Pauline, the parents realized the girl looked exactly like their daughter, but she wasn't her. She didn't recognize her parents, nor did she behave like Pauline. Either way, they still took her home, hoping her memories would return and maybe this was just amnesia. When she got home, even her siblings recognized her as Pauline, and no one was really talking about the fact she was found 200 miles away from her house and how the hell she got there. Like, are we just not gonna talk about that? Elephant in the room much. Either way, Pauline didn't even speak in her native dialect, but as time went on, the parents said she was becoming herself again. But the good news ended quickly, because fast forward a month, a cyclist found a body of a little girl near the family's farm, and it was in bad shape. Decomposed as hell, and the hands, feet and head were all missing, and next to the body was a folded outfit. Pauline's mum recognized the clothes as being the same ones Pauline wore the day she went missing, and the location the body was found was searched many times previously, indicating the body had been left there quite recently. Near her body was an adult male head, which clearly did not belong to the decomposed body. So we literally have an imposter girl living on the farm now who isn't Pauline but could be her doppelganger. We have actual Pauline dead near the farm, and we have a random male head. Like, what is happening at this point? How has none of this been solved? Like, where's Pauline? Who is this twin Pauline? Pauline! Coming in at number 5 are the noises. Back in December of 2016, a CIA officer went to the health office in Havana after apparently feeling nauseous, dizzy, and having a headache. Which is, I mean, fair enough, people get sick in the winter, it's no biggie. But 2 days later, 2 other CIA officers reported the same thing. 2 years later, this number had grown to 39 officers, and each victim claimed the symptoms had been triggered by a bizarre noise they'd heard in their hotel rooms or their homes. One claimed it was very high-pitched, almost like a beam of sound had just been pointed into their room. Another person said it was like the sound marbles make when they roll across the floor. The CIA was completely blindsided by this because they hadn't developed any weapon or knew of any weapon that could cause these symptoms, and if anyone would have known about it, it would have been the CIA. Some of the victims had even recorded the sound, but that just made things worse. Scientists analyzing the sound said they were insects, but how could insects lead to symptoms like that? It just doesn't add up. In May of last year, an American worker posted in the US consulate in China was diagnosed with the same thing, so no one knows what's happening, but CIA agents are dropping like flies, which may not even be a bad thing. They have done some pretty messed up throughout the years, just saying. At number 4 is the Tunguska event, and I'm pretty sure I said that wrong, I'm sorry. So back in 1908, 770 square miles of forest in Siberia was just spontaneously flattened by some explosion of some kind, except there was no evidence of an explosion and absolutely no witnesses. Scientists called it the largest impact event in history, and an impact event is basically an impact between 2 astronomical objects, aka an asteroid and the Earth. Except with an impact event, there's usually an impact crater, which there wasn't. Scientists have only been able to speculate what happened, like maybe an asteroid exploded over the Earth, not on it, and the resulting explosion was just the after effect. Maybe it was the airburst of a meteoroid, we literally have no clue. There were just a bunch of forests that got flattened, and we're just gonna leave it at that, apparently. Filling our number 3 slot are the Hinterkaifeck murders. Back in March of 1922, in Weidhofen, Germany, the 7 people living on the Hinterkaifeck farm were all found dead. But things were already getting creepy leading up to the incident. Days beforehand, the maid of the family quit, claiming she felt the house was haunted. The father found a bizarre newspaper in the house that no one had bought, and he'd also found footprints leading to their machine room outside, yet no one was in there and no one had gone in there. At night, the family would hear footsteps in the attic despite finding no one there, and so a ghost inhabitant was very much possible. The new maid Maria arrived, and that day 4 family members were believed to have been lured to the family barn and then murdered by a mattock. The killer then went into the house where he killed 3 more people, and all the bodies were discovered a full 4 days after the murders. The family failed to show up at church, the kids were absent from school, and the postman realized the family's mail had been there from a few days ago. Eventually Eventually, the village guide went to the house and entered the barn and found the bodies. During the investigation, the weapon was nowhere to be found, and after the autopsies were done, they found out that one of the children was actually alive for hours after her assault. She had pulled out her hair in tufts while laying in the straw in her own blood. People speculate someone actually did kill everyone, whereas others think it could have been the ghostly presence that had something to do with it. Honestly, who knows? I feel like it could have been a possession of some kind, because why would the little girl be pulling out her hair after she was assaulted? Like, unless she was possessed? I don't know. Now at number 2 are the Circleville letters. At the end of the 1700s, the citizens of Circleville, Ohio were under attack by a serial author. Locals around town started getting anonymous letters filled with intimate details about their lives and how the author was supposedly watching them. The worst victim of this was a woman called Mary Giuseppe. She was the bus driver of one of the schools and was having an affair with the superintendent. The letter said things like, "I know where you live, I can hurt your children," and soon after, Mary's husband Ron even got a letter about it, and soon the whole town was rife with rumors. 2 weeks later, she got another letter saying she'd done nothing since the last one and that she had to inform the school board, otherwise the author would expose her on CBS and etc. Why are they going to that much effort to expose her? I don't understand. The letters then stopped till Ron got a call which infuriated him so much he left the house with a gun, got into his car and never came back. His car was found crashed into a tree, Ron was dead and the gun had been fired, yet the receiver of that bullet is still a mystery. Mary and the superintendent ended up getting married later on, and the writer was hell-bent on embarrassing her by posting signs and posters of it all around town. Like, this guy really has it for her. One time she got so frustrated she went to rip off a poster and found it attached to a string, which she followed and was led to a box with a gun pointing right at her. The gun got traced to her brother-in-law Paul, and he was put in jail for being the writer. Case closed, everyone in town breathed a sigh of relief now that the guy had been caught, yet while he was in jail, Paul received his own letter. And nothing's been solved ever since. And finally, at number 1 is Susan Powell. Now this case has so many twists and turns, I was struggling to keep up, but here goes nothing, you guys better keep up. Susan disappeared on the 6th of December back in 2009, and a decade later is yet to be found. Susan was married to a man named Joshua, and the couple had 2 kids, but there were marital problems, they were intense, and they were plenty. Susan and the 2 boys went to church on the 6th, and the whole family were reported missing the next day. Police broke into the house to find nothing out of the blue except 2 fans blowing a newly cleaned couch dry. Joshua came home that same day with the boys, saying he had taken the boys camping while Susan was asleep and had just returned. Now here's where things get sus. Now why the hell would Joshua take his kids camping after midnight in the winter when he's meant to be at work hours later? Not only that, but when the couple initially got married, they lived in Joshua's family home, where his dad Stephen grew an infatuation with Susan. He would follow her around, record her, steal her underwear, etc. And she even wrote in her will that her death may not be an accident, even though it looks like one. When police started investigating, they found no evidence of the camp Joshua described. They found Susan's phone in his van, they found Susan's blood on the floor of the house, and at this point Josh is looking like the culprit 100%. When police spoke to one of the sons, he said that the camping trip did happen, but their mum had gone with them but hadn't come back with them. The other younger son kept drawing pictures of a van at daycare and kept saying mommy was in the trunk of the van. Josh tried to play the whole thing off by saying Susan was having an affair and the 2 had run off to Brazil to be together. That turned out to be false, and Stephen, Joshua's dad, claimed the 2 had been in love before she disappeared. Like, these people are throwing Susan under the bus left, right and center, and she's not even alive to defend herself. Police arrested Stephen after finding a bunch of child pornography and tapes of girls that didn't know they were being filmed, including Susan, on his laptop. Her family were all sure that Joshua had something to do with her disappearance, but the case remains unsolved and her body remains missing.